Cinderella and Fae charming. Chapter 1. Shauna hid behind the apple cart, pressed hard against the wooden panels, hoping the shopkeeper wouldn't see her. She moved forward slowly, just far enough to see Mr. Ward. Hopefully he would go inside soon. She'd already pocketed 2 apples from the cart, but that wasn't going to last long. She needed something more substantial. Mr. Ward manned his stall like the best of them, his eagle eye sweeping the market again and again, looking back and forth. His prices were close to ridiculous. But everyone bought from him because his meats and baked goods were to die for. Almost literally, in her case. If she was caught stealing again. Shauna stayed hidden because Mr. Ward was watching for people like her, vagabonds who were going to steal from him. She hated that eating came to this, but had to do something to get food in her stomach. As if in response, her belly growled. It had been 2 days since her last meal, and she was starting to become desperate. The smell of the baked goods from Mr. Ward's shop wafted toward her on the wind, making her giddy. Damn it, what was taking him so long? She'd seen him drink 3 pitchers of water. The sun was hot, beating down from above. When was he going to go pee? Usually Mr. Ward's stall had a red tarp as a cover that blocked out the sun, and made his stall stand out for the buyers to see. But this morning, a freak wind had ripped it off and torn it in half. Okay, so maybe that freak wind hadn't come from Mother Nature. Maybe it had been Shauna's dwindling Fae magic that had played a part. But she needed him to leave his stall, and getting rid of his shade was the only way she could think of to get her hands on some food. She hadn't meant to tear the tarp, only to blow it away. It had been an accident. But when it came down to her survival. Finally, he turned around. Billy, he called his assistant, who stood on the corner with 2 rolls in his hand, telling passers-by about the food Mr. Ward offered. Watch the stall. Billy hurried over and nodded. And for God's sake, keep an eye out for thieves. You cost me more than I make sometimes because you're asleep on your feet. Billy nodded again. He couldn't speak. It was the only reason he was still working for the bald-headed man with the pot belly. Mr. Ward had fired more than a dozen assistants because he said they gave him too much attitude. Mr. Ward was an older Fae and once upon a time used old magic, but he didn't anymore. No one knew why. He was just a humble merchant now. As soon as Mr. Ward disappeared, Shauna made her move. She lifted her hands and summoned the tiny bit of power she still had left after this morning's stunt. If she didn't have food in her belly, she couldn't summon any magic at all, and her magic had become the only thing she could rely on now to survive. The apple cart started to tremble, and then it started to dance from side to side. The wheels had been locked, but the cart rumbled and the apples started to fall off one by one. And then they fell in a bigger avalanche. Billy opened his mouth in a silent cry, and leapt toward the apple cart. Fae magic ran strong through his veins, so the cart responded to his touch and already started to steady. Shauna took her chance. She had to work fast. She ran from behind the cart, darting past Billy on the other side so he wouldn't see her, and yanked her bag from her back. She opened it and grabbed the first things that fell into her hands, not paying attention to what they were. When she looked over her shoulder, Billy had the cart stabilized and he turned to face her. He froze when they locked eyes, her hand still on a block of cheese. Billy started toward Shauna, his face a mask of anger. She yanked the cheese from the board, turned and made a break for it. She stuffed the cheese into her bag as she ran, scurrying through the market stalls. She took a left, a right and another right, and turned left again, winding her way through the market so that Billy wouldn't catch her. Twice, she looked over her shoulder and didn't see him, but she didn't stop until she was on the far side of the marketplace where she knew he couldn't follow. He wouldn't leave the stall for too long because if Mr. Ward found him away, when he'd been told to watch it, Billy would be in a world of trouble. He already would be for what she'd stolen, but hopefully Mr. Ward wouldn't notice. Or at least, not all of it. A pang of guilt shot into her chest. She wondered what her father would say if he saw her now. Billy was going to take the fall for her theft, and her father wouldn't approve. But today it came down to a choice between Billy's job and her possible starvation. She had to choose herself. Surely her father would understand that. She started walking through the narrow streets of Vanborn, one of the larger cities in the Boreal Court, an area known for its plantations. The court fed the mouths of thousands. The Fae who lived in the city were well known for their earth magic and the incredible produce they could grow with it. Merchants from far and wide came to buy here and take their purchases back to villages like Credale and Blackwallow, where the magic there was focused on other things. Shauna kept to the back alleys and put her head down. She wore a hood so that her red hair wouldn't draw attention, and didn't make eye contact even with those she knew. She was truly ashamed that she had to steal to eat. The back alleys were for those with no class and no money. The noblemen and merchants used the wide roads that accommodated their luxurious vehicles. It didn't take long for her to reach the crude shelter she'd created for herself. She climbed the ladder she'd built almost a year ago, hopping onto the roof and following the thick wall to the far end, where another building, one with 3 stories, met the one she stood on. The building junction created a corner, and she'd added a few beams and brown tarp to keep out the sun and rain. A weather spell had allowed her to waterproof the shelter, and it was perfect to stay in. Well, maybe perfect wasn't the right word for it. It was makeshift and ugly and far from luxurious. But it was home, and it was hers. She crawled in through the opening between the tarps and sat down, unpacking her bag to see what she'd gotten. A hunk of meat, a round bread that smelled so good her mouth watered, and the block of cheese. She'd nearly lost that one, but she hadn't wanted to give it up for the sake of getting away sooner. Cheese had fat in it, and she needed the energy. This meal alone would keep her going for a few days, before she'd need to find the next target. Shauna lifted the bread and took a huge bite, moaning in pleasure as she chewed. She could feel her strength returning with every morsel. Magic danced in her veins and shivered along her skin. Carefully she put down the bread and picked up the meat with one hand. She took a big bite, loving the juiciness of the piece while holding her other hand palm up. She pushed her magic into being, so that it danced on her palm like a blue light, and smiled, relishing in the feeling of her power returning. She shouldn't wait so long before eating again. She had to make sure she found something sooner. Suddenly, as if something had yanked at the power, her magic shot from her palm onto the wad of blankets and rags she slept on, and they caught fire. Shit! She cried out, and grabbed for her lumpy pillow, swinging it and pressing down on the blankets to stamp out the fire. When the flames were finally extinguished, she coughed and spluttered, her eyes watering from the smoke. She took some deep breaths, trying to calm down after the shock. What on earth had just happened? It was the second time today she'd lost control of her magic. The first time had been when she'd made that tarp blow off and split. She'd used weather magic to summon the wind, and although she only meant to create a small gust, the wind had ripped the tarp down the middle instead. Something was wrong. Her magic had never been like this before. She had to work out what was wrong with it. But first, she had to sleep. A suddenly full belly after being hungry so long was making her drowsy, and she needed to recover her strength before she headed into the city again. Shauna lay back on the singed blankets and rags, trying to avoid the spot of cinder where the flames had eaten her bed, and closed her eyes. I'll have to scavenge some more materials to replace that blanket now. Suddenly she sat up, and scrambled to find the little wooden box hidden amongst the blankets. When her fingers finally clasped the small box, she found black markings from the fire and she anxiously opened it. Inside, the silver locket that had belonged to her mother was safe, unscathed by the fire. Thank the heavens. She let out a breath of relief and closed the box again, tucking it back under the blankets. At least the locket was safe. She closed my eyes and this time it was easy to fall asleep. Shauna, Father called. Where are you? Where's my little girl? I covered my mouth with my hands, and tried to suppress a giggle that would give away the hiding spot behind the living room curtains. Father was walking through the house looking for me, and so far he hadn't found me. Where's my little munchkin hiding? He asked again. He was in the room now, and a thrill traveled through my body. He was so close. So close. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to will myself invisible. My magic wasn't very strong yet, but I would learn. Father said he would teach me. Wind ruffled my hair, letting it fall over my face, and lifted the curtains I hid behind, so I squealed. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up. My father stood in front of me, a grin on his face. "I found you," he said, and scooped me into his arms. "I couldn't hide," I said, pushing my hands into his beard. "I couldn't make myself invisible." "You'll figure it out, sweet pea," Father said, and pushed my hair out of my eyes. "You'll be just as powerful as anyone in the Twill family. I'll show you." I wrapped my arms around his neck and breathed in my dad's scent. Shauna sat up and looked around. It was late, much later than she would have liked, but the sun hadn't yet set. She took a deep breath and could almost smell her dad's scent on her clothes. But that was a long time ago. It had been many years since he'd passed away. And even longer since he'd married Valerie and brought her 2 awful daughters into the house. It had been a long time since Shauna had known anything like the real happiness she'd experienced as a child. Unable to remain quietly in her shelter, as remnants of the dream settled uncomfortably in her chest, she climbed back down to street level. She would go and see the only real friend she had in the city. When her feet hit the cobbled alleyway, she started walking in the direction she went almost every day. Her feet knew the way, and they carried her through the city that was starting to pack up and get ready for the night. The tailor's shop was in the middle of town, squashed between a shoemaker and a hatmaker. She'd always thought it was funny that anyone could be dressed from top to toe between those 3 shops, but Blaze never saw the humor in it. When she pushed open the door, the cool shop interior offered relief from the heat outside. Then Blaze turned from a stack of fabric bolts and smiled at her. Chapter 2. "Well, if it isn't Cinderella," Blaze said, his forest green eyes twinkling in amusement and his shaggy black hair hanging around his pointed ears. Shauna rolled her eyes and walked to the stool in the corner, sitting down. "Don't call me that. I don't sleep in front of the fire anymore." Which was exactly where her stepmother had made her sleep for years before she'd had the guts to get up and leave. Blaze chuckled. "Your living quarters right now aren't much better." She ignored his quip. It was true, her shelter was crude and dirty. But it was free of her evil stepmother and 2 self-absorbed stepsisters. She didn't have to answer to anyone anymore or work her fingers to the bone, and that counted for something. "So," Blaze continued, stacking the bolts of material expertly. "Word around town says that someone stole from Mr. Ward." Shauna shrugged. "There are a lot of thieves around here." "Yeah, but you're the only one who picks on Billy because he can't say anything to rat you out, and his magic is strong enough to replace most of what you took." She didn't respond, though he was right. She was the only one who picked on Billy. But what else was she supposed to do? No one would give her a job, and she would literally starve to death if she didn't steal the small amount of food she got her hands on. "I'm going to have a different life one day," she said. "And then none of this will matter, and it won't happen anymore." "How?" Blaze asked. "You know how hard it is to find work. Even this shop is barely hanging on. It's just not the same anymore in Vanborn." He was right, of course. "I'm willing to take my chances," Shauna said. "You were better off when you lived with Valerie." She rolled her eyes at him. "And then what? Concede to be her slave for the rest of my life?" Blaze shook his head. "People like Valerie don't live forever." Shauna knew what he was saying, that her evil stepmother would eventually get old and die. But he'd obviously forgotten she had 2 horrible daughters that she doted on, and would make sure they got everything, and Shauna got nothing. She hadn't even been able to fall back on the fact that she was the daughter of a nobleman. Valerie had hidden all the evidence that she was anything other than a servant girl. So instead of living the life of a lowly slave, she'd left to make her own way. But she didn't manage all too well on her own, she knew that. Her life wasn't better when it came to her class and station within the city. Van Born had a social structure that was strictly related to money and bloodlines. She was determined to find a better life one day, even if she wasn't quite sure how she was going to do it. "I'll work it out," she said to Blaze, grinning at him cheekily. "Who knows, one day I could be the wife of a baron or a duke or something. Maybe end up in the palace. Yeah, and pigs would learn to fly." Blaze snorted. "You? In the palace?" He burst out laughing. "You're not cut out for palace life." She looked at him with fake indignation. "Why not? I could be a princess, you know." Standing up, she grabbed at her two loose clothes, twirled on her toes and curtsied. "And what, let someone wait on you hand and foot every day? You're far too independent for that." Shauna flopped back down again. She shrugged her shoulders and swung her feet on the stool. Blaze was right, to an extent. She was independent, and did like doing her own thing. Her late father had always said how wild she was, and how she would often choose to do something for herself, even when there were other people paid to do it for her. She'd hated working as a servant for Valerie, and having all her independence crushed out of her. After her father passed away, Valerie had made her sleep in the kitchen and scrub the floors, telling her she was no longer the lady of the house. Living in the palace was a far-off dream, of course. But she wasn't a fool. The chances of that happening were zero. It was still nice to dream of a life that wasn't so difficult, that she had to fight for survival every single day. "I just think the people in the palace could make a difference to their people," she said to Blaze. "Their lives are easier. And they could make choices that have far-reaching effects for the greater good." "They're not saints, Shauna," Blaze said. "They're just really rich. They live in their palace, removed from reality, and they don't care about people like us." She wasn't sure she agreed. She knew that the king and queen had to make sure that Van Born was taken care of, and they had to keep the peace with other cities in the Fae realm. But surely, they were capable of doing more. "What do you know?" she teased. "I dressed the Fae prince, remember?" Blaze said. Right, she remembered something about that. Blaze's boss had been summoned to create an entire wardrobe for the royal family, and Blaze had been a new assistant at the time. The other guy had been sick and unable to come to work, so Blaze had been the lucky one to go along. "What was he like?" Shauna asked. "Spoilt," Blaze quipped without hesitation. "Acted like he was better than everyone else. Even though he's Fae just like us. He has power and magic, beyond anything we've ever known, of course. It comes with the royal bloodline. But that doesn't mean he's superior to others. He seemed to think he was some kind of god or something." She said, thinking out loud. "The royals can't be that bad." "They are," Blaze countered. "Trust me. That Fae prince and his royal family." He shook his head. She didn't answer, not sure she entirely believed him. "You have to leave," Blaze said. "The shop owner will be back soon to lock up, and if he catches you here, we're both in trouble." She nodded and hopped off the stool. "I'll come to see you again soon." Blaze grinned. "Try to stay out of trouble, okay? One day they're going to catch you, and you'll be sunk." Shauna smiled back. "I can't make any promises, but you know they'll never catch me." "Never say never," Blaze warned. She laughed and skipped out of the shop into the darkening alleys that wound their way around the outskirts of the city. Night fell and the dusk grew thick, making it hard to see where she was going. Luckily, she knew the way off by heart. She didn't go back to her shelter right away. Instead, she wandered into the center of the city. The marketplace was almost completely closed up and packed away, but she felt compelled to see her former home. Shauna soon found herself in the newer part of the city, where the houses were large and luxurious. The Fae wandering around were dressed in fine silks and velvets. She walked along the wide roads and passed by expensive cars. She kept to the shadows so that she wouldn't be noticed right away. Her ragged, dirty clothes and tangled hair would give her away as being out of place, and she would be dragged back to the poorer side of town if someone raised the alarm. But she had to see it again. She needed to look at her true home once more, before she fled back to the part of the city that didn't treat her as her stepmother had. Like she was a pebble in someone's shoe. The house she'd grown up in looked as it always had. It was large with bright sparkling windows. Yellow light filtered through from around the curtains, and Shauna heard music floating out from inside. The garden was immaculate, with perennial flowers in bloom. She hid in the shadows of a large tree, leaning against the trunk as she peered at her childhood home. The house held so many happy memories for her, all which had been created when her father had still been alive. Any chance at future happiness had been shattered when he'd suddenly died of an unknown illness, and the house had fallen to Valerie and her 2 daughters. Someone came up the driveway, and Shauna pressed herself against the dark trunk of the tree, hoping not to be seen. The man, a delivery person it seemed, knocked on the door. A moment later the door opened, and there stood Mona, the housekeeper. Shauna's heart sank. When Valerie had sent Shauna to the kitchens, Mona had been like a mother to her. She missed Mona greatly. For a moment, she allowed herself to be lulled by the music and laughter spilling into the night from behind the housekeeper. Her heart hankered for more. It had been a year since she'd left, and she missed the cozy warmth of the house and the doting affection from the servants who had become family to her. Had it really been the right thing to leave home? The sight of the house drew her closer. She wanted to go back. She wanted to fall into Mona's arms and tell her of all the things she'd been through. She wanted the servant to rub her back and tell her stories of princes and princesses and true love. Just like she used to. Shauna made to move, one foot already stepping forward in the direction of the house. But she caught herself. The memories she longed for, the warmth she missed so dearly, wasn't there anymore. It hadn't been present for a long time. Shauna had left because all that remained within those walls was pain and bitterness. There was more than enough money left behind by her father to ensure a wealthy life for Valerie and her daughters. But none of that would help Shauna, and going back would only cause more misery and pain. It was why she had run in the first place. So instead of going toward the house, knocking on the door and telling Mona and everyone else that she had returned, Shauna turned her back on the past and made her way down the street. Her heart ached as she walked further away. It's just memories, she kept reminding herself. Father's gone. Valerie is evil. There is nothing there for me now. Even Mona's presence can't change that. She repeated those words until she reached her crude shelter, the place where she'd evaded law enforcement and the elements for almost a year now. She curled up on the blankets and rags, then took a deep breath and sighed heavily. Blaze had said there was no way Shauna would fit in at the palace, and he was right. At least, not the way she looked now. She reached under the blankets, and curled her fingers around the wooden box that held the locket. It was worth a lot, so much that if she sold it she could change her life. She wouldn't be nobility as she had been before, but she'd never have to steal food again. At least not for a long time. But the idea of selling her locket made her sick. There was no way she was getting rid of the only thing her mother had left her. It also reminded her of her father, and the happiness of her childhood. She thought how amazing it would be to live in a place as grand as the palace. To be able to have a break sometime, or a life where she didn't have to worry about survival. Where every day it was a struggle to remain alive. It would be nice just for once to wake up, and not have to worry about anything. The way it used to be, a long time ago. Chapter 3. The next few days were easier. Shauna had the food she'd taken from the cart, so she didn't have to steal anymore. She hated having to break the law like that, and to rob others when they were putting in an honest day's work to survive. But everyone had their own troubles, and that was the life she had to live right now. No one else would look out for her if she didn't look out for herself. It had been like that in many ways since her father had died. Shauna had steered clear of the market since she'd stolen the food. She didn't want any trouble, and the last thing she needed was for one of the merchants or sellers to point her out as the thief who had stolen from Mr. Ward's stall. But she was getting bored with hanging around the back alleys. Blaze was always busy. The shop owner had returned from his travels, and Shauna wasn't allowed to be around if the owner was there. He didn't like her. Given her current circumstances and rough appearance, she didn't blame him. So she had wandered back to the market in the end, walking amongst the stalls and looking at various wares for sale. She wished she could spend money here. There were wonderful things to buy, intricately designed jewelry, beautifully crafted hats and delicate shoes. She steered clear of the food area where Mr. Ward was set up, and enjoyed being out and about, walking around. A lot of the sellers looked at her warily, sure that she was going to try and rob them. But Shauna had no intention of doing that. Not today. She made sure to keep her hands in the open, so they could be seen at all times, and smiled at the sellers, making conversation to show that she wasn't a threat to their livelihood. She would be again in a short while, but that was a different worry for another day. A flash of white in the periphery of her vision caught Shauna's attention. She stopped and looked again, trying to ascertain what she'd seen. White hair hung down a broad male back with strong shoulders. When the man turned his head, his pointed ears stuck through hair that was pulled back from a sharp face with chiseled cheekbones. She had the urge to get closer. She hurried between the stalls, keeping her distance at first, watching the Fae as he wandered. She hadn't seen him in the marketplace before. He was proud, she could tell that right away. He carried himself with a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance. But judging by the rags he wore, there was no good reason to be so confident. His manner intrigued Shauna. She followed him, watching as he too studied the wares for sale and moved through the marketplace. Shauna passed by a stall that was enclosed, and she lost sight of the white-haired Fae. When she emerged on the other side of the stall, she couldn't see him at all. She spun around and looked back the way she'd come. Had he stopped at another stall or turned back? How could he have disappeared so quickly? He was nowhere to be seen. She hurried forward a few paces and then back a few, but she couldn't find him at all. Her heart sank. She didn't know what it was about that Fae, but something had drawn her. Something. "Why are you following me?" a deep voice demanded from behind her, and Shauna spun around. She looked up into the eyes of the white-haired Fae. They were a deep purple, and magic swirled within them. "I'm not," Shauna said, her heart beginning to pound like a drum in her chest. "I sensed you. What do you want?" She frowned. What did he mean, he'd sensed her? "I didn't mean to be rude, sorry. It was just that I haven't seen you around. I was curious who you were. That's all. Are you new in Vanborn?" The man hesitated before he finally nodded. "Yes, I'm not from around here." She smiled, not wanting to be unfriendly, though her stomach still jumped a little from nervousness. There was something unsettling about him, but she couldn't put her finger on why. "Well, you'll find the city a fun place for our kind." "Our kind?" he asked. She nodded, indicating the clothes he was wearing. Little better than the rags she wore. "You're not dressed like a merchant or anyone special. So, you're not going to get any special treatment here in the marketplace. Trust me." She tugged at her own clothes, wishing for the 100th time that she had regular access to clean water. The Fae grinned at her suddenly, and her heart leapt in her chest at the transformation. Before he'd been striking. Now he was even more handsome, so much so that she forgot to breathe for a moment. His smile made his face light up. He really was rather beautiful, she realized. His body was lithe and clearly powerful. He had the same pale skin that marked all the Fae that came from Vanborn though, so Shauna found it strange that he claimed he was from somewhere else. "And who are you?" he suddenly asked. "Shauna," she said, holding out her hand for him to shake. "Hansel," he said. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she had no idea where from. He took her hand, and when he did, his power coursed through Shauna's veins. She gasped at the sensation of being plugged into a power source that was too strong. She jerked back, feeling as if she'd been shocked. Hansel grinned at her. "Can't handle a bit of magic?" Of course, she could handle magic. She'd been taught by the best when she'd been younger. her father had overseen her studies himself, and later, she'd practiced what she learnt, even though Valerie had chased away the maestro who had taught her. She knew what she was doing. "I can take anyone," she challenged. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." "I'm sure," he said with a wicked grin, and something about the way he looked at her made her insides ache. She fought the urge to take a step toward him, and instead took a couple of steps back. She would not give in to whatever sorcery she had felt radiating from him when their skin touched. "Well, it was nice meeting you, Shauna," he said. "Maybe I'll see you around before I go back." "Go back to where?" she asked. He only laughed, the sound slightly husky. She felt as though he was caressing her skin once again, and she shivered, her body responding to him in a way she hadn't experienced before with other Fae men. With any men, in fact. She wrapped her arms across her middle in a protective gesture, willing her heartbeat to slow down to normal. "Goodbye, Shauna," he said, then turned and walked away without a backward glance. She realized after he'd gone that he hadn't answered her question. Who was he? And why had she responded in such a primal way to his presence? She huffed in irritation at her own body. Part of her wanted to run after him, call him back, and demand answers. She wanted to know what this strange thing was that she'd felt the moment she set eyes on him. She was intrigued by the feeling of his magic as well. It was so different to her own. She fought the urge to go after him, just as she had fought his pull when he stood in front of her. She didn't want him to know that he had such a strong effect on her, no matter what it stemmed from. She was better than that, stronger than that. She had to be, living on the streets. She forced herself to turn and walk away in the opposite direction to the one the stranger had taken. The rest of the day she tried to keep herself busy wandering, but she couldn't stop thinking about Hansel. Why had he affected her so much? He was just another Fae. A vagrant like her from the looks of him. And that meant that as long as he was in town, he would be competition for the meager handouts offered by opportunity. She hadn't thought about that when she'd met him. Was he going to make life difficult for her? How was someone with that much power a vagabond? Why did he have to steal to make his way through life? Surely his magic could be better used elsewhere. The wealthy Fae often created positions for their own kind. Especially those with unique powers. She was sure there would be a number of Fae who would jump at the opportunity to employ someone like Hansel. The moment he'd come into her orbit, she'd felt the strength of his powers. None of it made sense. A lot of things about the Fae didn't make sense though. Hopefully she would see him before he returned to wherever he'd come from. When dusk fell, she made her way back to her shelter. It had been a long, hot day, and she was exhausted and hungry. She had a bit of food left, enough for one more day before she had to steal again. She looked forward to a good night's rest. She was sitting in her shelter when she felt something. At first, it wasn't anything she could put her finger on. It was more of a shift in the atmosphere, a change that felt out of place. She settled into her blankets once more, and was just about to doze off when she felt it again. This time it was distinctly different, like a wave of warmth, in stark contrast to the chill of the night. Someone was there. Just outside. They'd found her shelter. She pushed up from her bed and crept to the opening, peeking out through the crack. The night was clear, the stars were shining brightly, and all seemed quiet and peaceful. She couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. But just as she went to pull back, a shadow moved and she froze. She stared hard, and a moment later the shadow moved again. She wasn't alone. It was definite now. She summoned her magic, pulling it from her core. Her heart began to race and fear trembled beneath her skin. She forced herself to remember her training and tried to remain calm. Was it her stepmother? Had they found her after all this time? Her shelter was almost impossible to spot from the ground. She'd made sure of that. The adjacent building had no windows looking out. She'd taken great care to construct her makeshift home in just the right place for concealment. Her power rippled over her skin, warm and demanding. She scraped courage together so that when the shadow passed again, she was ready. She jumped from her hiding place. Lithely, silently, she landed on her feet, crouching with her hand on the ground. Her other hand was up, magic dancing in her palm, ready to strike at a moment's notice. The shadow swirled toward her, and that same wave of heat washed over her. She didn't waste another second. Her father had taught her if she wanted to get ahead in a fight, she had to be on the front foot from the start. If she attacked without waiting, the chances were high that her opponent wouldn't be ready. That wasn't the case. When she blasted magic from her palm in the direction of the shadow, it parried the blow with a wave of magic of its own. She gasped when she felt the pushback. This person's magic was far stronger than she'd expected. She threw more of her own magic at the shadow, and suddenly they were caught in a fight. Shauna attacked, blasting power head-on, then ducking to avoid the return blast. She had to try something different. The second time, she made a mock attempt to attack, and when the shadow blasted its magic first, she countered with a different sort of power, summoning the weather magic she'd used before. A whirlwind whipped around the shadow and forced it to the ground. In the process, Shauna caught a flash of white hair reflected in the moonlight. She frowned and stood over the shadow, her hands charged with power, her chest heaving. The fight had somehow taken more out of her than she expected. "Hansel?" she asked tentatively. The shadow sat up, and in the darkness, she made out the pale features of the Fae she'd encountered in the marketplace. "Why are you following me?" she asked, repeating the same words he'd spoken earlier to her. He pushed himself up and released a slight chuckle. She let go of the magic she'd brought to the surface, and allowed it to fade away. "I needed a place to sleep," he said, looking bashful. "When night fell, and I wasn't sure where to go, you came past not too far ahead of me and I decided to follow you." Shauna frowned. "What makes you think I'm going to give you a space in my home?" He shook his head. "I don't expect that. I was planning on sleeping out here on the roof before you attacked me." "Attacked you?" she cried out. "You started it with your strange magic pushing at me." He frowned. "Strange magic?" he echoed. Shauna shook her head, aware she was being rude. "I don't mean to discriminate. I know you're not from around here, so of course your magic will be different to mine. You just scared me, that's all. I thought my shelter was under attack." Hansel shook his head. "I apologize. I didn't mean to cause concern." That made her calm down a little, and she took a steadying breath. "Well, you can come inside. I'm fine sleeping on the roof." "I'd rather have you where I can see you," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. Hansel nodded and grinned. She let him follow her into the shelter. When he looked around, she felt embarrassed, and stopped herself from thinking back to the life she'd once had. "It's not much," she said, and felt silly that she was making excuses. It was more than Hansel had, after all. "I think it's great," he said, and it didn't sound like he was making fun of her. "Even so," Shauna snorted. "If you think this is great, I don't want to know what you're used to." He sighed. "A world very different from this one." Shauna wanted to ask exactly what world he was talking about, her curiosity piqued again, but she stopped herself. He would tell her if he wanted to. Instead, she picked up her food bag. "Are you hungry?" He eyed the bag. "Do you have enough?" "Yes." She didn't, but it felt wrong not to offer him something to eat. She knew too well what it was like to go to bed hungry, and even though she didn't know Hansel, she didn't want to be the reason someone suffered. Besides, that magnetic pull she'd felt in the marketplace had returned, and she wanted him to stay as long as possible. "What?" he asked when he caught her staring, and she shook her head and cleared her throat. "Eat," she said. "And then you can help me steal more food tomorrow to earn your keep." He grinned. "I can do that. I'm sure we can figure something out if we work as a team. You can distract them with your looks, and I'll make off with the food." Shauna felt her cheeks heat up. Her looks? He leaned toward her, and for a moment she had the strangest feeling he was about to kiss her. Her mouth dropped open, not because she was shocked at his possible action, but because her body suddenly filled with such yearning that it almost overwhelmed her. She stared into his swirling eyes. They were shadowed in the darkness, but their purple depths were still somehow visible, and she felt herself drowning in his essence. She wanted him in ways she had never experienced before now. Then he blinked slowly, and the yearning dissipated. She stared down at the bag of food in her hand, her mind a mess in which she couldn't seem to create a single thought. Food. Oh yes. He must be hungry. Eat, she said, more self-conscious than she'd ever been in her life. She thrust the bag at Hansel, willing him to take it and stop staring at her in that mesmerizing way. And then we should sleep, she added, determined to sound normal. Tomorrow is going to be a hard day, and it's better if we get to it early. After a long moment he took the bag from her, nodded and sat down. Shauna sat too. She tried hard not to stare at him while he ate, but it was difficult not to relive that moment. Had he been about to kiss her? What if he had? What would she have done? Hansel was unlike anyone she'd ever met. He was as beautiful as he was unusual. How did someone like him end up as poor as her? Chapter 4. When Shauna opened her eyes, the sun was bright in the sky. It was much later than usual, strange for her to have overslept. She jerked up on her blankets and looked around. The shelter was empty, Hansel was gone. She'd given him a place to sleep last night after sharing food together, and it had been nice to have a warm body close to hers again. Even though her body and face heated up once again when she thought of that moment of connection. Now that he was gone, she felt the strangest sense of abandonment. She stood and stretched, then glanced at the food bag in the corner of her small shelter. After last night's meal, it was empty again, and today she would have to go looking for more. He told her that they would work together, and that fact, combined with the fact that he was now gone, made her feel even more down. But the bag didn't look empty. Far from it. She walked the few steps over to the corner and picked up the bag. It was much heavier than an empty bag should be. She frowned and opened it up. Oh my! It was full of food. More food than she'd seen in a long time. Bread rolls, meat, cheeses, fruit, some things she would never have been able to get her hands on. How had he done this? Why had he done it? And why did he just leave without letting her know, or at least saying goodbye? Intense relief and gratitude swept over her as she tucked into the food. There was so much she was able to eat her fill for the first time in months, choosing to indulge rather than rationing out each morsel. After eating, she decided to head into town. She liked people around her and listening to their stories. She enjoyed the cadence of life teeming within the city walls. It made her feel less lonely, less like an outcast. Today, no matter how much she wandered and listened to people laughing and chattering all around her, she couldn't shake the pressing sense of loneliness that had befallen her the moment she realized Hansel was gone. She didn't know him at all, he was a stranger from another town. So why did she feel so surprised when he left without a word? It shouldn't have mattered, but something about his presence had made her feel almost like she'd come home. And now that he was gone, that feeling had left along with him. She felt as lost and confused as she had when she'd first left her stepmother's house. After walking around, moping for a while, she ended up in the neighborhood where she used to live once again. It was dangerous to be there during the day. She didn't want Valerie or her stepsisters to see her. She hated knowing how they would sneer at her and cackle at how she'd fallen from grace, even though they'd been the ones to push her. She didn't like being recognized by others who lived in the neighborhood, and who'd known her father. She was ashamed of what she'd become, nothing more than a street urchin and a thief. But she couldn't stay away. Her home drew her, and she stood in her vantage point under her usual tree, hoping that the boughs hung low enough to shelter her when there was no darkness to do the job. A man wearing a suit pulled into the driveway of the large house. When he climbed out, he adjusted his tie and ran his hand through his hair, making sure it stayed where he'd slicked it back before he walked to the front door. Shauna frowned. The advertising on the side of the vehicle read, Van Born Realtors. They were known as the best realtors in the Boreal Court. What were they doing at her house? When the front door opened, Valerie herself greeted him graciously. Shauna scowled when she saw the woman who had never been a substitute for her real mother. How her father could have loved Valerie enough to bring her into his home was beyond her. Even though she understood more about love now that she was older, she still didn't know how he could have done it. She truly believed that Valerie had only pretended to love her father so that she could get her hands on his riches. Valerie wore a green velvet dress, her graying hair pinned up into an elegant updo. Shauna could see the woman's jewelry shimmering all the way across the lawn. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but a feeling of unease settled in her stomach. A moment later, her two stepsisters stepped out to join their mother and the realtor on the porch, each of them wearing bright colors, their hair curled and pinned in ridiculous styles that made them look like peacocks. Shauna shuddered when she saw them. Lantana and Daria. Oh, how she despised them. They were entitled, foolish creatures who believed that everything would come to them simply because they wanted it. They'd had a cruel streak when Shauna lived with them, and they hadn't been afraid to take out their ill feelings on their stepsister. Despite her better judgment, she moved closer, straining to hear the conversation. When we move, I'm getting a suite all to myself, Lantana said loudly. Me too, Daria answered back. Oh no, you're not. I'm the oldest, I get to have something like that. You're still a child. I'm only a year younger than you. They continued bickering as they walked down the driveway and turned into the road. Shauna pressed back tightly into the tree's shadows, hoping the two horrid girls wouldn't spot her. Luckily, they were too caught up in their argument to notice her. A car came to pick them up and whisked them away. Only then did Shauna breathe a sigh of relief. She didn't know how long she stood waiting under the tree, but finally, the door opened again and Valerie and the realtor stepped out. He was smiling broadly, and Valerie wore her syrupy smile, the one she used when she wanted to sway someone to her viewpoint. I'll let you know as soon as I can, the realtor said. But I don't see why there would be a hold-up. We'll have the house sold in no time. Shauna's blood boiled in her veins. Valerie was selling the house. She couldn't believe it. It was her father's house, and since he had passed it was rightfully Shauna's. As soon as the realtor left, Shauna jumped from her hiding spot, too incensed to take care. What the hell do you think you're doing? She cried out. Valerie spun around, her velvet dress swishing around her ankles and her face twisted in surprise. When she saw Shauna, her face changed, the surprise fading into a smirk. She folded her arms over her chest. Oh, it's you, she said, spitting the word as if it had a vile taste. What are you doing here? How can you sell the house? Shauna demanded. It's my father's house. Not anymore, Valerie said. It's my house. Your father is dead. And there's nothing you can do about either of those things, you good-for-nothing little rat. Shauna's magic rose to the surface, boiling and bubbling in her rage. She started to tremble. Valerie laughed and took a step closer. Oh, little Cinderella, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Do you really think you can take me on? My magic is far more powerful than yours will ever be. You never completed your training. With that, Valerie let her own magic flare up, her dress the same colors as her magic. The power floated from her very skin like misty fog, but a hellish green, swirling up and around her. Shauna backed away instinctively. This magic was bad. It was unstable. She could feel her own magic recede, coiling away from Valerie's badness. What have you done? Shauna asked. What I've always done, Valerie said, looking down her nose. Whatever I want. And no one is going to stop me. I can get a fortune for this house and everything in it, and I'm going to do just that. The money your father left behind is gone, and I'm not going to live a life of poverty. You wasted it all? Shauna asked, incredulous. Her father had been wealthy, very wealthy. How could Valerie have spent it all? Valerie laughed. Your father is dead, Shauna. Did you think it was going to last forever? It was meant to, Shauna bit out. Valerie shrugged, and her magic intensified, pushing against Shauna like a giant hand. Shauna shivered and tried not to keep backing away, but Valerie's power was strong. Stronger than it had been when Shauna lived here, much stronger. This wasn't right, magic didn't just increase like that. Not unless she'd come by it in some nefarious fashion. You should leave, Valerie said. She hated to obey anything Valerie said, but the woman was right. Her magic was too powerful, and Shauna knew that if she didn't leave, she would soon find out exactly how powerful Valerie had become. The hard way. She turned her back, a mistake in most cases, but she had to grit her teeth and trust that Valerie wouldn't slam her with magic from behind. She walked off the property and down the street, leaving her family home behind. What if this was the last time she would ever see her house? What if someone else bought it and her memories disappeared? For some reason, Shauna had always believed, in her heart of hearts, that the house would be hers one day. Somehow. One thing was for sure. There was no way she could ever go home again. A sob caught in her throat as she stumbled along the road. Her heart was breaking, and she didn't know what to do. She needed advice. Help. A friend. Chapter 5. Blaze was in his shop, but unfortunately the owner was there too. Damn it. Shauna stood at the shop window, and flared her magic slightly, hoping to draw Blaze's attention. She was most comfortable with weather magic, it was the magic she used when she needed to steal food. At first, she created just a flurry of leaves. Then a stronger wind. When Blaze still didn't notice, she closed her eyes and focused on her power. She summoned a small cloud, and made it rain against the shop window, bouncing out of the way so she didn't get drenched. She waited around the corner, hoping it was enough. Anything more and the owner would know something was up. Shauna didn't want to get Blaze in trouble. A short while later, he arrived. What are you doing here? He asked. I can get in big trouble for this. I'm sorry, Shauna said. She tried to keep talking but her voice caught in her throat and tears filled her eyes. Blaze's face softened. What happened? It's Valerie, Shauna whispered. She's selling my father's house, and there's nothing I can do about it. Blaze's eyes widened, then he bit his lip, looking torn over what to say. He thought for a moment and then said, I'm taking my lunch break in an hour. I'll talk to you then, okay? I'll meet you right here. Shauna nodded, relieved she was going to be able to talk to someone, even though he likely wouldn't have any answers for her. When Blaze disappeared again, she sat down and waited. It was out of the way enough that she didn't get scolded for loitering on one of the main roads, and she kept to herself. Only 1 or 2 merchants glanced in her direction, but they left her alone. When Blaze finally returned, ready to take his lunch, Shauna jumped to her feet. They walked to the market stalls together. She told Blaze everything on the way, from overhearing the conversation, to the way Valerie's magic had presented looking a lot more powerful than before. She left out the part about Hansel. She wasn't sure what to say, or how she felt since he'd left. The loneliness had caught her off guard, and she was afraid Blaze would tease her about it. What does your father's will say? Blaze asked after she'd finished her story. What? Shauna asked. Your father's will. He should have a last will and testament that says who everything goes to after he dies. Shauna hadn't thought about that. Her father had died when she was much younger, and she hadn't known about things like that back then. Even now, it seemed almost bizarre to think about it. I don't know if there is a will, she said. There will be, Blaze said, sounding certain. He was a wealthy man who'd lost his first wife, and had to raise a daughter alone. He would have thought about what would happen after he died. He would have had something drawn up to ensure your future, I'm sure. If you can get your hands on that will, it should tell you if you're entitled to keep the house for yourself. She couldn't believe she hadn't thought about that before now. Was it really possible that she was entitled to something by law? Something Valerie couldn't take away? What if it was the house itself? What if it was something that she could stake a claim to, and there was nothing Valerie could do? The thought made her dizzy. What about her magic? She asked. I don't know about that, Blaze said, shaking his head. It sounds to me like she's doing something wrong. If I didn't know better, it sounds unseelie to me, but it couldn't be. Valerie is seelie, isn't she? Shauna nodded. I think so. I mean, it never came up. Father would never marry an unseelie. Unless he hadn't known. The traitorous thought popped up out of nowhere. It doesn't make sense that your father would marry against his values, Blaze said in agreement. Shauna was torn between what she knew about her father and what she felt. It wouldn't make sense that Valerie was a wicked unseelie, the evil counterpart to the Fae she'd grown up around here in the Boreal Court. But seelie Fae didn't have the kind of magic Valerie had shown, so what other explanation could there be? Get your hands on that will if you can, Blaze said, coming back to the original topic. And then you'll know more. Shauna nodded and thanked him for the chat. She left him to his lunch, her mind spinning with possibilities and her confidence at least partially renewed. She should have gone back to her shelter, but instead, buoyed by what Blaze had said, she ended up back at her father's house. She crouched next to some shrubs and waited, trying to see if anyone was home. She didn't know if the girls had come back yet, and Valerie would be around somewhere no doubt, but Shauna had to get inside. She tried to think where something like a will might be kept. Probably in the attic, where her father's belongings had been moved after his death. Valerie had cleared out his entire office, and had it packed up in boxes, turning the room into her personal parlor where she could be alone. Shauna had hated the transformation. Her father's office had been one of her favorite places in the house. She used to curl up and read a book there while he worked, or study the maps where he'd traveled, or draw pictures while he wrote his letters. But once Valerie had taken over the space, Shauna had no longer been welcome in the private parlor. She shook herself and came back to the present, focusing on the task at hand. She took a deep breath, and crept out from her hiding spot and into the garden. She hurried across the lawn and pressed herself flat against the side of the house, moving around it. Whenever she passed a window, she ducked beneath the ledge so as not to be seen and continued moving. She tried to use her magic to make herself more difficult to see, but she wasn't sure how well it was working. When she got to a trellis with a climber growing all over it with thick, green vines, Shauna tested it for strength. It seemed strong enough to hold her weight, and carefully, putting one foot above the other before doing the same with her hands, she climbed higher and higher. The window she was aiming for opened into one of the spare bedrooms, and the ladder to the attic was just outside that room. Unless Valerie had rearranged the layout of the house even more, but she was counting on the spare room still being empty. She made it to the top without falling, and thankfully the window was unlatched. She climbed in and dropped onto the plush carpet. She knelt there a moment, fighting the urge run her fingers through the thick fibers of the carpet, recalling days of relaxing in comfort. She shook her head at the brief folly. She had to keep moving. She strained her ears to listen for a sound, but the house was quiet. Wherever Valerie was, she wasn't moving around making a lot of noise. Shauna hoped she was still downstairs. Carefully Shauna crept to the door and popped her head out. She looked back and forth, seeing and hearing nothing untoward. When she was sure the coast was clear, she moved quietly to the attic ladder and started climbing. She made it up linto the attic without being caught, and let out a breath of relief before she started looking around. The attic was filled with boxes of books and documents. It looked like all the contents of her father's office, except for the expensive furniture. Shauna hoped Valerie hadn't yet sold off those pieces. She moved between the boxes, closing her eyes and using her magic to feel for the contents. As she ran her fingers over the lids, she heard whispers. It was the words of the pages between the covers of the books, in files speaking to her, telling her the contents. She moved fast, most of the books being fairy tales she'd read and recognized, or work orders for her father's travels. Finally, she reached a chest pushed to the back of the attic. When she ran her hands over it, she couldn't hear anything at all. It was as if the attic had fallen silent, or Shauna's magic had been cut off. She frowned and tried to open the chest. The lid wouldn't budge. She tried again, pushing magic into her hands, willing the locking mechanisms to spring open. Again nothing happened. When Shauna pushed yet more magic into the chest, a powerful spell pushed back. It shoved so hard, she fell back onto the hard wooden planks. She froze, hoping no one had heard the thump. She listened, not moving, but no one came to investigate. The box had been spelled shut. Magic had been used to seal it. That could only mean one thing: the chest contained something important. Something someone wanted to keep hidden. That only made her more determined to find out what it was. She climbed to her feet again and knelt in front of the chest, wondering what magic to try and how to get into the box. She lifted her hands and closed her eyes, ready to tap into power she hadn't used in the longest time. But before she could do anything, other magic, evil magic, crept into the attic. It wrapped itself around her like a vice, over her wrists and ankles, draining her power completely. Shauna fell backward, unable to keep her balance. Footsteps clumped up the ladder and walked over the floorboards toward her, and when she looked up, Valerie stood over her. "How dare you trespass on my property?" her stepmother demanded. Chapter 6. Valorie glared down at her. Shauna struggled against the magic that seemed to bind her like shackles and chains, but it was too strong. "I told you to leave," Valerie said. "I should report you to the authorities." "But you're not going to do that," Shauna said. "And how do you know I won't?" Valerie asked. "You would have already," Shauna replied, her heart pounding in her chest despite forcing herself to stay calm. "You would have called them right away as soon as you heard me up here. You wouldn't have come to see for yourself." Valerie nodded. "You're right. I could have done it. And you didn't. Which means, what do you want?" "You're a smart girl," Valerie said, and she let her magic go. Shauna could move again, and she jumped to her feet. "It's a pity your life turned out to be such a waste. Your father doted on you, but he couldn't see what I see." Shauna felt a flash of anger when Valerie talked about her father, but she didn't take the bait. Valerie was trying to upset her. She'd done it since Shauna was a little girl, always telling her how useless and horrible she was. When Shauna was younger, it had been terrible to hear, but she had gotten to know Valerie over the years, and although the words stung, she'd learned how to bite her tongue. "What do you want?" Shauna asked again, ignoring Valerie's statements. Valerie lifted her head, clearly with a sense of self-importance. "I want to know why you're here. What are you looking for?" Shauna turned the question around in her mind. She wasn't sure what Valerie was playing at, and she didn't know what the response would be if she told her the truth. Would Valerie act out toward her? "It's the will, isn't it?" Valerie asked, when Shauna said nothing. "You're here to stop the sale of the house, so that you can hold on to your precious memories." The words dripped with menace, and she spat out the last word as if it tasted bad. Shauna hated that she was so transparent, and that Valerie knew her well enough to guess her motives. "If my father left me something, I have a right to claim it. It's the law." "You're right," Valerie said. "But unfortunately for you, there is no will." She said it simply, as though it was fact. Which it was not. It couldn't be. Shauna shook her head. "You're lying. There has to be one. And I think you're hiding it. In there." She pointed to the chest she'd been trying to open. "Why else would you have used magic to keep it shut?" Valerie cackled in a laugh that made goosebumps run over Shauna's arm, and the air crackled with magic that uncomfortably enveloped the air. She thought about the words Blaze had spoken, words that had crept into her own thoughts. Unseelie magic. "Oh Shauna, you're a fool," Valerie said. "If you want to see what's in the chest so badly, here." She waved her hand over the chest, and a surge of magic followed. A moment later, the lock clicked open. Shauna frowned, unsure what to do. Valerie was giving her what she wanted, so it had to be a trap. Valerie never gave anyone what they wanted, except her disgusting daughters, who didn't deserve anything. Go on, Valerie said when Shauna didn't make a move. Open it. It's what you wanted, isn't it? It was what she'd wanted. And if she didn't look now, she would always wonder what might have been. Shauna crept toward the chest, keeping an eye on Valerie and careful not to turn her back to her enemy this time. She didn't trust Valerie, not a single bit. She lifted the lid and peered inside. There were a few files and folders, old jewelry that looked like heirloom pieces, and a photograph or two. That was it. Shauna took out the files, glancing sidelong at Valerie, but the woman stood calmly picking at her nails with a bored expression on her face. When Shauna paged through the file contents, her heart sank. The documents were important, but they had nothing to do with a last will and testament. Nothing like what she'd hoped to find. She took a deep breath and let it out, trying not to show how disappointed she was. Thank you, Shauna said politely when she returned the documents to the chest where she'd found them. Valerie glared at her. Happy now? Shauna wasn't, but she couldn't say that. Poor thing, Valerie said, and for a moment she looked sympathetic. If Shauna hadn't known her as well as she did, she would have believed that Valerie actually felt sorry for her. But she knew, thanks to years of neglect, that Valerie had no tender feelings for anyone except herself. Everything else was an act for the rest of the world to think she was a saint. I know this is hard for you, Valerie went on. Trust me, it's not easy letting his things go. You're not the only one who's hurting, you know. I wish he was back as well. Shauna greatly doubted that statement. And to think that he didn't leave a will behind. Valerie said sadly, shaking her head as though she couldn't believe it. But he died so suddenly, he must never have thought of it. What an actress. Shauna didn't respond, but inside she was truly seething. She didn't believe that her father hadn't left a will. His worldly belongings couldn't all belong to Valerie, could they? She would never have left her home if she'd thought it would be sold out from under her. Now she would truly have nothing. Forever. You can't sell the house, Shauna said with renewed vigor, curling her hands into fists. She'd been temporarily disheartened, but her power returned as anger and frustration built inside of her. You have no right to do that. I have every right, Valerie said, her voice snappier than a moment before. Do you think you're the only one who lost something? I lost a husband, Shauna. My girls lost a man who was willing to be their father. We lost just as much as you did. But I have to make choices as a mother, and selling the house is the right thing to do. Oh no, Shauna said. I lost a lot more than you did. Although Shauna assumed there must have been love between Valerie and her father for them to have gotten married at all, it was hard to believe. Valerie was cold and calculating, and Shauna had the feeling the marriage might have been nothing more than a ploy to get something when Valerie had nothing. She narrowed her eyes at her stepmother. You have the house, his belongings, the status that came with it all, and you don't deserve any of it. The house is mine. It has to be. Valerie smiled with faux sadness, and the expression only made Shauna angrier. With the rage came a surge of magic so strong she struggled to keep it under control. The few boxes around the attic started to tremble, dancing on the spot. Oh, you think you can take me on, do you? Valerie asked, seeming not at all alarmed at the display of magic. Shauna wasn't trying to take Valerie on. Her magic had never felt this unstable, and she wasn't sure what to do to stop it. If you know what's best for you, you'll leave here, Valerie continued, just as calm and collected as before. And you'll never come back. You had a place here. A place on the floor in the kitchen. In front of the fireplace among the ashes, Shauna interrupted. But you gave that up when you decided to leave. You're not welcome here anymore, Cinderella. The nickname made Shauna's ears ring and a flash of white filled her vision, as her anger threatened to take over. Her magic surged and boxes were flung to the side into the attic walls. Valerie still didn't look concerned. Instead, she responded with magic of her own. Power filled the air, and it was so thick it suffocated Shauna. She tried to fight it, but Valerie's magic wrapped around her neck and started to choke her. She tried to respond, reaching down deep to find her own magic, but she couldn't feel any. Her anger had been replaced by fear, and her magic had disappeared. Was this it? Was this the moment of her death? Would Valerie kill her? She wouldn't even be missed. The only person who would worry about her at all would be Blaze, and what would he do? The authorities wouldn't care about a thief. One less to torment the streets of Vanborn, they would say. Shauna's vision began to dim. She became strangely resigned to her fate when Valerie withdrew her magic. It happened so suddenly she lost her balance and fell to the floor, coughing and heaving, gasping for breath. "Let that be a lesson to you," Valerie said. "The next time you step onto my property, I'm not going to stop at a simple spell. Now, I'm going downstairs and the servants will fix me a cup of tea. And when my tea is finished, you had better be far, far away from my property. Do you understand, girl?" Shauna nodded. Her stepmother had won. Valerie looked pleased with herself and started walking away. "In case you get it in your silly head to come looking again, there really is no will." She looked over her shoulder at Shauna. "Do you think that if there were, I wouldn't have destroyed it?" She cackled, the sound skipping and dancing around Shauna, who blinked at Valerie in disbelief. "You can't do anything, little girl," Valerie added as she descended out of the attic. "Only the king's decree can change things now." She disappeared from view, and Shauna's eyes stung with unshed tears, a lump clogging her throat. What was she going to do now? Valerie would kill her if she came back. Even if she was willing to risk it, she wasn't going to find a will. Valerie had obviously destroyed it, so there was no proof it had existed at all. And since Valerie had married Shauna's father, by law everything reverted to her until she died. Shauna wouldn't be in Valerie's will, no matter what happened. There truly was no way to change the way things were. Unless Valerie had mentioned the king as a joke, a way to make Shauna feel like all hope was lost because she was no one and the king was unreachable to someone like her. But what if he wasn't? What if Shauna could find a way to speak to him, to convince him of the unfairness, the wrongdoing, and have him decree that she got what belonged to her? With a new determination, and a plan formulating in her head, Shauna climbed out of the window she'd come through and made her way down to the ground again. Valerie might have won this round, but the game wasn't over yet. Chapter 7. Shauna had made up her mind. She was going to see the king. All she had to do was convince him of the truth, that her father's death had led to her being kept as a slave in her own home until she ran away. That her stepmother was so evil, she would go to any lengths to make sure Shauna received nothing from her father's legacy. She had to convince him of the injustice of it all. Valerie was a villainous snake, and as soon as Shauna could convince the king, he could decree that she received what she deserved. She was owed her father's house at the very least. She was sure that would have been what her father wanted. Valerie and her daughters did stand to get some of the inheritance. They were her father's new family after all. But Shauna wanted what belonged to her as well. And she was going to make sure she got it. It took a few days to set it all in motion. First, she went to the offices of the realtor who had met with Valerie. It wasn't easy to get in and be taken seriously with her appearance the way it was. She wore rags for clothes and her hair was dirty and tangled. She hadn't had a bath in the year she'd been gone. She looked like what she was, someone who had been living on the streets. But she managed to talk her way into the offices, saying that she couldn't rise in station if no one was willing to give her a chance. That played on the emotions of the secretary, and finally, she was let into the realtor's office. But the realtor was less than receiving toward Shauna, and refused to help her at all, except to answer one question. When she asked him how long it took to sell a house, he told her proudly that he could get it done in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That was all the time Shauna would have. But at least, she knew the house would be safe until then. After she'd gone to see the realtor, Shauna had to wait for the next date when commoners were allowed to see the king. The king had allowed the citizens of Vanborn to meet with him on occasion and tell him their grievances. He would select matters that were close to his heart and step in, taking care of the business on behalf of his people. The king believed he was giving back to his people in this way, and the people of Vanborn loved him for it. All Shauna had to do was get in line, tell him her story and appeal to him so that he would change her life. It was simple. Her story was more than sympathetic enough for the task, she was sure. Not only because it was the truth, but because her home had been ripped away from her through the selfishness of her stepmother. The day arrived. The king would see his people, and Shauna walked to the palace feeling nervous and excited. She didn't walk through the back alleys this time. Instead, she walked along the main roads with the merchants, the well-off citizens and noblemen and women. She knew that she looked different than the others. They were well-dressed and confident, filled with pride. They believed they had every right to be there. But today, Shauna didn't feel out of place. She had an urgent matter to bring to the king, just like the others, and she walked between them with her head held high. She ignored the looks of curiosity and disgust cast her way. The queue was already long, even though she'd come early to find a space, but she was willing to wait however long it took to get to the king. She was doing this for a greater cause. She was going to win back her home and make sure it was never sold. As she walked, a flash of white hair drew her attention and she frowned. She looked up and suddenly Hansel stood before her. "Shauna," he said with a smile. "Hello, Hansel." She spoke with a reserved tone, but her stomach erupted in butterflies at the sight of him. Hansel truly was handsome. He made everything inside of her melt. She hadn't forgotten that he'd left her without saying goodbye though. Even if he'd gifted her a lot of food. "I thought you'd left town," she said. "I assumed that was why you didn't forage with me." Hansel chuckled, falling into step beside Shauna as she walked. "That's an interesting way to put it." "What would you call it?" she asked. "Stealing," Hansel said simply. Shauna huffed. She knew it was stealing, and she knew it was wrong, but it wasn't her fault. She had nothing. She felt even more strongly about it now than she had before. Valerie had driven her to a life of crime and desperation. Never in her previous life had she ever wanted for anything. Her father was an incredible protector. It was only now that she had to suffer and steal to keep herself alive. She didn't respond despite her frustration. "Anyway," Hansel said. "I did leave, but I came back." "Evidently so." "Where are you going?" he asked. Shauna glanced at him, not sure how much to share. They'd had a strangely lovely night together, and his companionship had been welcome, but she felt betrayed that he'd left her so abruptly. Having Hansel around, even though briefly, had only reminded her of her loneliness, and she wasn't sure if she wanted more of the same. "You do realize these people are all going to the palace to see the king," Hansel pointed out. Shauna nodded. "I know." "And you're going with them?" She nodded again. "I have an urgent matter to bring before the king." He burst out laughing. More than was necessary, in her view. Shauna frowned at him. "What's so funny?" "I'm sorry, it's just that you think you can get into the palace to see the king at all." Shauna stopped in her tracks and glared at Hansel. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well, look at you," Hansel said, his face sobering, although laughter still danced in his violet eyes. "You're ragged and dirty. They will never allow you to enter the palace." So the king is a snob? He doesn't believe his people can see him to share what they need, unless they're rich enough not to need anything in the first place. "That's not what I meant," Hansel said. "But look around you, Shauna. These people walking to the palace gate, they're all wealthy. Merchants or nobility or visitors from near and far, who come to the king with matters of great importance. And you're?" "I'm what?" Shauna challenged. "Tell me what I am that makes me unworthy." Hansel sighed. "You're twisting my words." "Am I?" "I didn't say you are unworthy. You implied it." He shook his head. I'm not saying you don't deserve to be heard. I'm saying that the king won't hear you. There's a difference. Shauna stared at him. And how do you know so much about the king? She asked. Hansel shrugged. I just know things. Shauna rolled her eyes. Leave me alone. I'm going to see the king, and you're not going to convince me that it won't work. They'll arrest you, Shauna, Hansel said. The guards keep their eyes out for Fae like you. I'd hate to see you end up in a dungeon, just because you won't heed my warning. Shauna ignored him. She wasn't going to allow Hansel to throw her off course, to convince her that she wasn't good enough to be seen by the king. She had a case, and she was a citizen, just like everyone else. She had rights. Sure, she had no money, and she looked ragged just as Hansel said. But her worth didn't lie in expensive clothing and jewelry. It lay within. She kept walking. Did you hear me? Hansel called after her. They'll arrest you, as soon as you get to the gate. Shauna walked on, not willing to listen. She came closer to the palace gate and watched as others were let through. The gates were open, and the guards stood to the side, talking to each other and laughing, barely taking note of who passed. Shauna would pass without struggle too, she was sure. Hey! Stop! Hansel shouted behind her, and suddenly magic curled around her wrist and yanked her out of the line of Fae walking toward the palace. What are you doing? Shauna asked, fighting the magic. You're going to make me lose my spot, and then I'll have to wait all day. You shouldn't go, Hansel said. She was suddenly furious that this outsider was telling her what she should and shouldn't do. He was using his magic to force her to his will, and that only infuriated her more. How dare he? Let me go, she cried and tried to yank away from his magic. But his power was strong, and came with the surge of heat she'd started to associate with him. But she'd had enough of being thrown around and forced into something with magic. Seeing Valerie had already been more than enough, and now Hansel was doing the same thing. She summoned her own magic, felt it in her palms bubbling through her veins, and when it was ready she threw it at Hansel. He staggered back, clearly not expecting the sudden blow, and his magic let go of her for a moment. She ran toward the line where she'd been, and tried to take her place again, but the merchants who had stood behind her protested. Get to the back of the line, they cried out. I was here first. You snooze you lose, someone else shouted. Don't do it, Hansel said through gritted teeth, and his magic yanked Shauna back yet again. She spun around, furious, and blasted him with her magic. You made me lose my spot, she shouted. Hansel was ready for her power, and this time he blocked it, sending it back at her. They were starting to create a spectacle. The townsfolk gathered to watch the fight. Shauna was happy to fight it out with Hansel right there. Give them a show if that was what they wanted. Hansel had started this, and she would show him that she wasn't a toy to be manipulated. But he ducked into the alley behind him. Oh no, Shauna cried out. You're not getting out of this so easily. She ran after him, since she'd already lost her place in line and with it, her chance to see the king today. Coward, she called as he ran further into the alley. When she finally caught up to him, she was out of breath. He seemed fine. He looked at her with those violet eyes that pierced her soul. What's wrong with you? She demanded. Why are you ruining my life? I saved you, Hansel said. You wasted my time. You don't know that they would have arrested me. Just because they do it wherever you come from. Her eyes stung with tears, and she had a sudden lump in her throat that stopped her talking. Damned if she was going to cry in front of him. She wouldn't let him get to her. Instead of saying anything else and betraying her emotions, she summoned her magic, bundled it up and threw it at Hansel. He withstood it easily, as if he'd expected it, knocking the power down with his own. It only angered Shauna more, and she did it again, pushing more power into the surge. Her power felt like it was teetering out of control, unstable because of her emotions. It was just the same as when she'd been in the attic with Valerie. But she didn't care. Her anger was getting the better of her, and she wanted to make Hansel pay. She was about to lose everything that mattered to her, and Hansel was ruining it all. It would be all his fault. Her power trembled through her body. Her hands ached with the need to release it, and her stomach twisted with the knowledge that she might no longer be in control. Her magic was getting away from her, and she wasn't sure why. Suddenly, Hansel was right up against her. His face was mere inches from hers, his body so close a sigh could press them fully together. Immediately, the anger went out of Shauna, replaced by something else. Something warmer, that tingled through her veins in a completely different way to her magic. The heat of Hansel's power washed over her like a stream of warm water, and she wanted to swaddle herself in it, curl up and rub against him like a cat in heat. What was wrong with her? Why did she feel this way whenever Hansel was near? But it wasn't just the magic that pulled her up short. There was something else there, something underneath. The way he looked at her, the way her breath caught in her throat and her heart fluttered. He was too beautiful for words. Her gaze focused on his mouth, lifted up at the corners in a tiny grin, as if he knew his effect on her body and was enjoying it. She bit at her bottom lip before moistening it with her tongue, and saw his eyes drop to study the gesture. Would he kiss her? Her head dropped back in preparation, but he didn't lower his head. Instead, she felt the delicate caress of his fingers down the exposed line of her neck. He stopped at the base, resting a fingertip right over the top of her suddenly racing pulse. You have beautiful soft skin, Shauna. His voice held a huskiness that shivered through her. She couldn't continue. He confused her in so many ways. Then his hand dropped away, and he stepped back, and she remembered what had just transpired. The king. The palace. Their magic battle. What are you doing? She asked in a breathless voice. Saving you, he said. From the guards and from yourself. Shauna wanted to get angry, but she couldn't find it in herself to do so. She blinked at him, then he stepped further away from her, and whatever spell he had cast over her finally broke. She stood on unsteady legs, watching him with a dazed feeling. He turned and walked away. Where are you going? She called out. The wind had been taken from her sails, and she felt very shaky. I have a few things to take care of. Don't go looking for trouble, Shauna, he said over his shoulder, before he turned the corner and disappeared from sight. She pressed the heels of her hands against her temples, and tried to figure out what had just happened. She was still furious, but it was dampened now somehow. Buried beneath waves of desire that still washed through her, even though he was now out of sight. She released a long sigh, then turned and headed back in the direction of her shelter, unsure what to make of what had just happened. The anger felt like a dim light compared to the heat that had filled her whole being, when Hansel had pressed his body against hers, and awoken things deep within that she had never felt before. Chapter 8. Shauna slept deeply. She was exhausted from using so much power and fighting the past couple of days. The exertions seemed to have drained her. First it had been Valerie, then Hansel. She just couldn't catch a break. When she finally opened her eyes, the sun was already higher in the sky than she liked. She had slept in again. And yet, she was lazy in getting up and heading out into the city today. She still had a bit of food that Hansel had left behind. It had lasted her several days and was only now running out. Soon she would have to head out and find more food. She needed to steal again, and though it went against her core beliefs, she didn't feel as if she had any choice. Life had not dealt a fair hand to her in recent years. But Shauna's mind wasn't on theft and survival this morning. That seemed almost petty. Of course, she would have to look after herself eventually, but there were bigger things at stake. She had to get to the king, and find a way to speak to him. She would have to wait another week now, thanks to Hansel, and that would mean her time was running out. It could take longer than 2 weeks for Valerie to get a sale on the house, but Shauna wasn't going to be foolish and hope for that. It was now urgent that she see the king as soon as possible. Perhaps she could get an audience with the king, without waiting for the palace gates to open to the city. Shauna didn't know enough about the rules of the kingdom. But she knew someone who did. Blaze might be a mere tailor's assistant, but he'd sat with his nose in a book since the day Shauna had met him. His knowledge of the city and its laws was unparalleled. Why he hadn't become an advocate, or gotten involved in palace business was beyond her. He deserved so much more. Blaze was alone in the shop when Shauna arrived. "Is your master gone?" she asked, making sure the coast was clear. Blaze nodded. "He's traveling, and should be a few days. You're safe." Shauna perched on the stool where she usually sat, and watched Blaze as he busied himself around the shop, measuring out lengths of material, choosing thread and buttons and everything else that made an outfit look dramatic and extravagant. She wondered if Blaze ever got jealous of those he was ordered to dress. Wouldn't he want to dress like that and live like that too? But she wasn't here to ask about his humility. She wanted to know other things. "I tried to see the king yesterday," Shauna said. Blaze froze, halting what he was doing, and turned to look at her with shock on his face. "What happened?" Shauna frowned. "What do you mean, what happened? You didn't even ask me what I wanted to see him about." "Well, you said tried, which means you didn't see him. Why not?" Shauna rolled her eyes in frustration when she thought about Hansel and how he'd thwarted her plans. "I was stopped by someone who claimed I would be arrested on sight if I tried to walk through the palace gates." "You should count your lucky stars someone pointed that out to you. Usually they won't help someone like you." Shauna huffed. "Why does everyone say that? Someone like me? It comes across as though I'm not worthy to be heard." Blaze hesitated. "The king won't think you are." Shauna threw up her hands. "So, everyone seems to think it was a bad idea, and no one cares that I desperately need the king to hear me out. What do you need to see the king for?" Blaze finally asked the relevant question. "I need him to decree that I receive what's rightfully mine." Blaze raised his eyebrows. She sighed and told him what had happened over the past few days, about breaking into Valerie's home in search of a will and not finding it. Then hearing from Valerie herself that Shauna had to see the king if she wanted anything to change. She left out the part about Hansel. For some reason, she didn't want to share the jumbled effect the white-haired Fae had on her emotions and her body, and it was easier not to mention him. When the tale was done, Blaze shook his head. "Of course Valerie told you to see the king alone. She wants you to be arrested. The guards will arrest you on sight. Only the merchants and nobility are granted access to his throne room." Shauna was shocked. "Am I not allowed any rights due to my social class?" "Unfortunately, that's how it works." "I don't understand," Shauna said. "So, Valerie lied to me. She doesn't want to see you succeed, Shauna. You should know by now that you can't trust her." Shauna nodded. She knew that, but hadn't thought that a statement made apparently in passing had been a setup. She was so manipulative. If it was true that she would have been arrested, Hansel had in fact saved her life. "Okay, so I'm not allowed to see the king," Shauna said. "So that's it? There's nothing I can do to save my father's house? My home?" Her disappointment was crushing. She'd felt hope after Blaze had told her there had to be a will, and then again when she learned she could see the king. But every time she thought she was making progress, and could finally do something that would change her life for the better, her hopes were dashed. To think that she would remain a street urchin for the rest of her life was beyond depressing. When Shauna had left her father's house, in her heart she'd always believed that one day she would be back. But now, she was starting to think that the day of return would never happen. Had it been a mistake to leave? Had she been wrong? But if she hadn't left, Valerie would have found a way to get rid of her now that the house was being sold. Blaze hesitated to answer her question, and Shauna was aware of his awkwardness as he continued his work. "What are you not telling me?" she asked. "Well, there is one way you could see the king," he started. "How?" "You need to be presented by a member of the nobility." Shauna frowned. "I don't know a member of the nobility." Blaze gave her a pointed look, and she shook her head. "No way. There's no way. Valerie won't help me, and even if she would, no way. Blaze shrugged his shoulders and returned to the stacked bolts of fabric, measuring their lengths. When he was done, he placed the pattern on the fabric and started cutting out the different parts that would eventually become clothing. It's the only way you're getting in there, Shauna, Blaze said. Without her help. She kept shaking her head. When she'd said she didn't know anyone noble, it was because she didn't see Valerie as noble in any way. The woman was cunning and awful, and she had no qualities that made her noble. But she had married Shauna's father, a nobleman, and so she had been promoted to that social class. If what Blaze was saying was right, and it probably was, Valerie could present her to the king. If she so chose. She was also the very person who wanted Shauna gone. She would never present her to the king, only to allow Shauna to state her case against Valerie. I'm doomed, Shauna stated sadly. There's no way. I'm sorry, Shauna, Blaze said, and he sounded like he truly meant it. If I could help, I would. What about your master? Shauna asked. Would he take me? The shop owner was classified as a merchant, and would be allowed to have an audience with the king. Before Blaze answered, she already knew what he would say. His master wouldn't present her to the king. He didn't like her. Most citizens of Vanborn felt that way. And there was nothing Shauna would be able to do to change his mind. He would get her arrested the same way Valerie would. It truly seemed like this was the end of the line. There was nothing that could be done. Thanks for your time, Shauna said, hopping off her stool and leaving the shop. She liked spending time with Blaze, and would have stayed longer while his master was gone, but her mood had turned so dark that she didn't want to share that with him. He deserved to work in peace, without her misery overshadowing him. She paused in one of the back alleys, unsure what to do next. The quest to save her father's home had consumed her thoughts recently, and it had fallen flat. Now, she was as lost and untethered as she had been when she left home a year ago. The only thing to do was continue to survive. She was going to have to steal food to eat, and soon. Might as well focus on that, unless another option presented itself. Chapter 9. She gravitated toward the marketplace, slowly ambling through the city on her way. She wasn't in the mood to steal, she'd never really wanted to do that in the first place. Living on the streets had changed her. She had no way of earning honest money. She tried back then when she first left to get a job. But she had no special skills, and no one had wanted to hire her for anything. She only had her magic, and all the other Fae had that too. Nothing set her aside the way Blaze's knowledge and being a tailor set him apart. So stealing had become her way of life. It was a pitiful existence, but she wanted to live. Shauna wondered if Mr. Ward's stall would be unmanned again. It had been some time since she'd stolen from him, and maybe he would have dropped his guard a little. It would help if that was the case, so she wouldn't have to risk getting caught. Apparently, she had been close to arrest yesterday when she'd wanted to go to the palace, and she'd been caught by Valerie as well. Shauna wasn't ready for more of that. When she reached the marketplace, she headed toward the food quarter when she saw her two stepsisters. She ducked behind a stack of crates as Lantana and Daria walked past so that she wouldn't be seen. Lantana was a year older, and Daria was a year younger than Shauna. When they had first come to live with Shauna and her father, she had been thrilled to have sisters. She'd always been an only child, and was excited to have someone to play with and talk to. The two girls had been a great disappointment. Spoiled, fussy, and irritated with Shauna's very existence, they hadn't wanted anything to do with her. They refused to climb trees, and didn't want to run around on the grass. When Shauna had invited them to sneak out with her to swim in the lake just beyond the city walls, they had tattled to their mother, and she had gotten in trouble. From that first week onward, Shauna had realized the two girls weren't allies. Instead, they'd been traitors, enemies. Now she watched as they walked past her, dressed immaculately in the latest fashions that Blaze himself had tailored for them. They laughed and talked and pointed, mocking the common folk that manned the stalls and making fun of them for having to work for a living. Shauna felt her annoyance flare at their behavior. When they stopped in front of a stall with exotic drinks brought all the way from Blackwallow, they began to mock the stall owner's wares. Lantana said something about how vile the drinks looked, and Daria asked in a loud voice how the stall operator thought he could ever sell such poison to an unsuspecting crowd. Shauna acted without further thought, running from her hiding spot behind the crates to a stack of barrels a little closer, ducking behind them. The stepsister's nasty words grated on her. The two girls were entitled, bratty, and obviously believed they were above everyone else. Valerie had raised them that way, and Shauna hated how they insulted everyone around them, while doing nothing at all for themselves and demanding everything in return. She dug down deep, finding her weather magic. It was easier to bring to the surface, and safer to use than the other magic she possessed. At the back of her mind, the small voice told her she should be worried about magic that was so unstable. But she pushed the voice away, she would worry about that later. Right now. She focused the part of her power that spoke to water, and the jars on the table holding exotic teas started to tremble and dance. "What are you doing?" Lantana asked the stall owner. "Yes, what sorcery is this?" Daria demanded to know. The stall owner shook his head, watching the teas tremble in confusion. "This is very unusual," he said. "The teas are known to have certain abilities that will translate to the consumer, but this?" As he spoke, Shauna snapped her magic, and a sudden surge traveled through the air, making a jar of tea tip over onto Lantana. "Oh!" Lantana shouted, lifting her arms and trying to curl her body away from the tea that drenched her clothes. Daria started laughing, so Shauna did it again, making another jar topple over and splash the tea onto Daria this time. The two girls squealed and cried out, fussing about their wet hair and clothes. The stall owner stared at them. "You wicked man!" Lantana cried out. "These poisons are evil." They both stormed off and the stall owner shook his head. Shauna suddenly felt guilty. She had spilled 2 jars of tea, simply out of spiteful revenge, when he could have sold them for money. Shame filled her. What was wrong with her, that she would do such a horrid thing without even thinking about it? She started creeping away, when he called out to her. "I know you're there, child." Her cheeks heated, and she stood up from her hiding spot. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was out to get back at them, and I didn't think about what you might lose as a result. I can't repay you for the tea I spilled with coin, as I have none. Is there anything else I can do to repay you?" "It's okay," he said. "They were going to take it, they paid me for it, and were already saying they were going to try it so they could tell everyone how vile it was. You did me a favor." Shauna breathed out in relief. "Here," the stall owner said, and reached under the table, producing a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "Thank you," she said, moved by the man's kindness when she'd acted out of spite. "Be careful who you mess with, child," the man said, as Shauna tucked the cheese into her pocket. "I apologize. I don't usually look for trouble. It's just them." The man nodded. "Whatever your reasons, you should be careful what you choose to do with your magic. The line between seelie and unseelie is very thin, and you don't want to overstep it." Shauna frowned. "What do you mean?" "Just look after yourself," he said, not giving her anything else to go by. Before she could push for more, a handful of customers arrived, and Shauna stepped away from the stall to allow the owner to make more money. She continued on, grateful for the cheese she'd been given. It was one less thing she'd have to steal. Her mind had shifted from the hungry misery of her situation, to the temporary fun she'd had with her stepsisters. The act against them had been malicious, she knew that. But a tiny voice in her head insisted they deserved it. They hadn't done anything useful in their lives except be mean to others, including Shauna. Playing a couple of innocent pranks on them wasn't going to do any real harm, surely. The line between seelie and unseelie. Shauna shoved the comment from the stall owner away, and changed direction. Instead of making her way toward the food court, finding stalls that were undermanned or easy to target for food, she looked for her stepsisters. It didn't take long to find them, they stuck out among the rest of the crowd, their arrogance and loud complaining voices drawing all the attention to them. Everyone was staring as they exclaimed loudly, complaining about everything from cheeses to their new clothes, mocking every store owner and being condescending about items and wares. Shauna knew it was hypocritical to be so mad at them. She, after all, abused the shopkeepers who were making an honest living by stealing and not making an honest living herself. But she was merely trying to survive, whereas her stepsisters were looking for trouble, relishing in making others feel bad. She had the strangest urge to stop them doing that to others. She followed them around the marketplace, ducking behind crates and barrels and boxes, keeping out of sight but never falling too far behind. When the two sisters stopped in front of another stall, Shauna craned her neck to see what they were looking at. The stall sold brooches and other jewelry with beautiful, intricate designs. It was the kind of things the nobility liked to purchase. Lantana picked one out and held it against her chest. "What do you think, Daria? You think it will match my Sunday outfit?" Daria snorted. "That old thing? What do you want people to think of you?" She gave the stall owner a look of reproach. "Don't you have anything else? Anything that will actually look good, instead of making us look like paupers with this trash?" Shauna bristled on behalf of the store owner. She hadn't lived with the two sisters in a year, and she had forgotten how terrible they could be. She focused her magic, narrowing her eyes on the brooch Lantana held against her chest. It took a bit of magic, the kind of magic Shauna didn't use often, but before long the brooch jolted and pricked Lantana in the chest. "Ow!" Lantana cried out, and threw the piece of jewelry onto the table as if it was burning her. "Are you all right, miss?" the store owner asked, looking concerned. "Is this some kind of trick?" Lantana asked. "These things are dangerous." "Come, Lantana," Daria said, glaring at the stall owner. "Let's find someone else." They left in a flurry, and Shauna grinned to herself. This was too easy and far too much fun. Why hadn't she realized she could do something like this? It was innocent fun too. She was just giving them a bit of the medicine they deserved. Shauna continued to follow the sisters around the marketplace, making every experience a bad one for them. Every time they got hurt, complained, or were shocked that something strange was happening, Shauna enjoyed it. It was the first time she felt like she was exacting revenge. Finally, when the sun set, the two women gave up and headed home. "What are you doing?" Blaze asked behind Shauna. She spun around, feeling guilty that she had been caught. "I'm just having fun," she said. "There's nothing wrong with that." "If there is nothing wrong with it, why do you feel the need to defend yourself?" "Because you're sneaking up on me and demanding answers like I'm some kind of criminal." She did feel like she had been doing something wrong, but how was it fair that people who got everything in life weren't punished for being so horrible? Blaze sighed. "It will work itself out, Shauna," he said. "Don't compromise your own morals or beliefs for no good purpose." "I'm just taking matters into my own hands," she defended. "Taking matters into your own hands is one thing, but being mean is another. Using your magic for malicious reasons isn't going to end well for you." Shauna rolled her eyes. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, it was innocent fun. Besides, they will probably forget all about it the moment they get home because they have so much to distract themselves with." Shauna realized how bitter she sounded, but she wasn't going to retract her words. She was an adult, looking after herself, at least she was trying. She didn't need Blaze to tell her how to act. Blaze sighed again. "Why don't you come to my place tonight? I have a bit of extra food. You won't have to steal your way through the day tomorrow if you eat with me." Shauna frowned at her friend. "Why are you being so nice?" Blaze chuckled. "You would do the same for me." Of course he was right. If the roles were reversed, and it was Blaze in need of help and Shauna in a position to be able to give it, she would do the same. She could never have asked for a friend as good as Blaze, and she was grateful he was in her life. She had lost a lot in her life, but being on the street had brought her one good thing. A friend who would always be there for her. Chapter 10. The next few days passed without excitement, and Shauna was starting to struggle. She had nothing to do with her time other than wander around the city and steal things. And time was ticking by, and she had no way to save her father's home. When Valerie had mentioned that only by the king's decree would she get her home back, she had hoped that things might change for the better. But the more time passed, the more Shauna felt sure that all hope was lost. She wasn't going to get her father's home back. She wasn't going to be able to see the king, unless someone presented her, and that was never going to happen. The few people who did remember her wanted nothing to do with her, and they feared Valerie's reaction if they helped Shauna. The rest of the nobility didn't know who she was, and would treat her as a scoundrel. Shauna was back in the marketplace, looking at a stall, waiting for the owner to take a break, so that she could snatch something to eat. The piece of cheese she had gotten as a kindness was long gone, and the rest of her food had been finished days ago. The last good meal she had was the one she shared with Blaze. Last night she had been so angry she'd considered going back to Blaze and asking for more food, but she wouldn't do that to him. Life was difficult, not only for her but for Blaze too. He had a job that paid him a bit of money, but it was long hours, and he barely got time with his family. No, Shauna wasn't going to put any additional pressure on him. Shauna stopped in front of a new stall. She didn't know much about the owner or her habits. But Shauna sincerely hoped that she would leave soon. She had tried her luck at all the other stalls, and come up empty-handed. Finally, the store owner turned and rummaged for something beneath the table. It wasn't much, and Shauna knew her window of opportunity was tiny, but if she didn't take it now, there was no knowing when she would be given an opportunity again. She lunged forward, grabbed the first thing her hands landed on, turned around and ran. She had no idea what was in the parcel she had grabbed. It was wrapped in newspaper, and she didn't even know if it was edible. Everything else on the table had been, so this had to be too. After running a couple blocks, Shauna finally slowed. She had learned not to stop and count her blessings until she was sure that she wasn't being pursued. Even then, it was possible that the authorities would be put on her trail and they would find her. After listening for footsteps or shouts, and waiting for guards to appear, nothing happening. Then, Shauna finally unwrapped the parcel she had taken. It was indeed food, a whole chicken. It had been grilled over a fireplace, judging by the faint scent of wood that rose from the meat, and Shauna's mouth started to water right away. The chicken wouldn't last very long. Chicken was a dangerous kind of meat to keep for too long without being able to keep it cool. But it wouldn't last long, anyway. She was going to sink her teeth into it, and there was no way of knowing if she was going to be able to stop eating until it was finished completely. How long had it been since she had had anything other than cheese, bread and pieces of cold meat that were nothing more than scraps? A grilled chicken like this was an incredible find. Shauna tucked the parcel under her arm and made her way to her shelter, careful to take routes that wouldn't get her in trouble, back alleys where the guards wouldn't see her. It never hurt to be careful, and Shauna had been stealing so often from the same people lately, she knew that she had to start being extra careful, or she was going to wind up in trouble. Finally, after a couple of detours, Shauna ended up on the roof where her shelter was. She crawled between the sheets and sat down on her pile of blankets. She unwrapped the chicken, tore off one leg and devoured it without thinking twice. As soon as the bone was picked clean, Shauna tore off the next leg. This time she forced herself to eat slowly. She couldn't afford to stuff her face with the chicken, eating so fast that she made herself sick. She didn't have a lot of food often, and she had become accustomed to having an almost empty stomach most of the time. To distract her from the food she was eating, Shauna picked up the newspaper it had been wrapped in. It was stained with oil where it had been wrapped, but she could make out most of the writing around it. An advertisement caught her eye. No, not an advertisement, an invitation. To all the ladies of Vanbourne, an invitation issued by the king. A ball is to be hosted to celebrate the prince's birthday, and no expense will be spared to make this extravagant night one that will be remembered. Dress up and dance the night away with the heir to the throne. Happy birthday, Your Highness. She frowned and read the date for the party. It was a ball, and it was to be held in only a couple of nights. She double-checked the date of the newspaper, and confirmed it. It was definitely going to be soon. Well, wasn't that convenient? If she could go to the party, she would be able to speak to the king. Shauna didn't want only memories anymore. She wanted to be able to live a life again. She wanted people to stop looking at her as if she was a delinquent, and to start seeing her as the nobility she used to be. If that happened, she would pay back every merchant that she ever stole from. 10 times over. But she had no idea how she was going to pull off going to the ball. She had managed everything else since leaving home though, so this is just a new challenge. Every time she had thought she wouldn't be able to survive, her next meal had seemed almost impossible, and before she knew it, she had a bite to eat again. The ball would be the same. She didn't know how she would go, or what she would wear, but she was going to make sure that she had her audience with the king. Shauna continued to eat while she turned her plan over in her mind. Finally, after finishing the entire chicken Shauna had known that she lay back on the blankets and closed her eyes. Her stomach ached with the amount of food she had stuffed into it, but for the first time in a long time she was satisfied. Not just because she had eaten well, but because there was hope again. As she lay with her eyes closed, Shauna envisioned what it would be like to be among people at a ball. To wear an elegant dress, to be cleaned up and not having anyone look at her as if she was a beggar. Perhaps Blaze could help her with a dress. She wasn't sure if he would be able to make her something, even if it was only something she used for one night, borrowing it as it were, that would work. Otherwise, Shauna would make another plan. She could steal something. For a moment, she had the bizarre idea that she could sneak back to Valerie's house, break in, steal one of the dozens of dresses her stepsister owned. She doubted either of them would notice it was missing. They lived in excess, and barely cared what they put on the back as long as it was expensive. Certainly, they wouldn't miss a single dress. And if Shauna played her cards right, which she intended to, she would go to the ball and speak to the king and everything would change. As she started drifting off to sleep, Shauna pictured herself wearing the golden ball gown she knew Lantana had in her closets. She imagined herself arriving at the palace gates, the goblins bowing from the waist as she walked past, respecting her as an honorable guest, and not seeing her as the street urchin she was. They would guide her toward the ballroom, with everyone else already present. And as Shauna descended the stairs, all eyes would turn to her, and she would not be turned away. She would be beautiful, and they would all see her. Shauna knew that it probably wouldn't be like that, but it was good to dream. It was nice to feel something different other than worry about the future, and sadness about the past. And even though she knew that she was creating hopes for herself that would probably be dashed again, Shauna allowed herself to dream just a little bit, just this once. There would come a time when life would right itself, and Shauna knew she would end up where she belonged. She thought about what Blaze had said, everything was going to work itself out. When Shauna drifted off to sleep, for the first time in a long time, she felt happy. Chapter 11. When Shauna woke up the next day, it was with renewed determination for everything to work out. She would go to the ball thrown for the prince's birthday. She had to go. It was the only way she was going to be able to talk to the king without being presented by the nobility. But to go to the ball, Shauna had to dress the part. She would never be allowed through the palace gates, let alone into the ballroom, if she didn't look like all the other ladies that would attend. She didn't have any money to speak of, and stealing a dress was vastly different from stealing food. It just wasn't something that was readily available. The few dresses that were ready-made were in shops along the city square, that were continuously watched by shop assistants or owners. The rest of the dresses were tailor-made, commissioned by the nobility, and Blaze's master would then send him to take measurements and create the dresses. None of those options were at Shauna's disposal. But she had a plan. She was going to break into her father's house, yet again, and steal one of her stepsister's dresses. They would never miss it. She would choose something that they'd had for a while, rather than something new, and so she was guaranteed that Daria or Lantena would not want to wear it. They were serious about keeping up with the latest fashions, and last season's dresses were too old for them to appear in public with. Shauna made her way to her father's house, carefully moving through the streets where she couldn't stick to the back alleys. It was the second time in a row that she was going to the house in broad daylight, risking being seen by the neighbors who knew her. If it came to light that one of the dresses was missing, and Valerie learned from her neighbors that Shauna had been spotted, she would be in a world of trouble. But she had no alternative. She couldn't go at night because they would all be home, and she was guaranteed to be caught. It was a better bet to go during the day, when the chances were higher that all three ladies would be out of the house. Hopefully she could get in and out, without causing too much of a fuss. But those simple facts didn't stop her heart from pounding in her chest, nor fear from racing along her veins. Valerie had proven last time Shauna had encountered her, that Valerie could murder her and get away with it. So this was dangerous to say the least. But if it meant saving her father's house and perhaps getting her old life back, then the risk was worth it. She already had a few ball gowns in mind that she'd seen her sisters wear a while ago. She knew that they would not be missed. Daria and Lantena had a way of getting rid of the dresses that were no longer fashionable. It was only a matter of time. Shauna figured she wouldn't even be stealing, theoretically. She wasn't going to be difficult and try to take something new. Shauna hid among the shrubs in front of the house for quite some time when she arrived there without being seen, at least she hoped she hadn't been seen, and watched the house for movement. She saw Valerie through one of the windows, and she heard Daria and Lantena arguing a while later. The ladies were all home, and so Shauna couldn't risk going in. But she had time. She could wait all day, she had nowhere else to be. She had enough food that she didn't need to go to the marketplace right away, and she had nothing else to do with her time. Most of the time when Shauna had nothing to do, she was driven to wander through town out of boredom, but now she had a mission. While Shauna waited, she chewed on a few dry biscuits she'd brought along from her stash to give her something to do. It was close to lunchtime when the front door opened. Shauna perked up as she saw Valerie and both her daughters all leave the house at once. They chatted excitedly, talking about they would wear to the very ball Shauna was going to attend. She hadn't considered that they would attend too. At least, she hadn't considered what it would mean for her. Why would any of them pass up the opportunity to go to a party hosted by the prince himself? But she hadn't considered what it would mean if they saw her there. And what if they saw her there wearing one of their dresses? Of course they would attend, she'd been stupid not to think of it in the first place. Thoughts of dread and anxiety filled Shauna. She would have to stay out of their way as much as possible. After all, she wasn't going to the ball because she wanted to have a good time, to dance and drink punch and meet the prince. She was going to demand an audience with the king. She would do that as fast as she could. She would slip in, talk to the king, and slip out again before her evil stepsisters and stepmother saw her. It was the only way she was going to be able to get away with it. She waited until the three women were picked up by a car and disappeared down the road before she headed into the garden. She walked around the house, carefully creeping past the windows so that the staff inside wouldn't notice her. Shauna started climbing up the wall, where she'd gotten into the top floor window last time she was here. When she silently lowered herself onto the plush carpet in the bedroom, she breathed a quick sigh of relief, then made her way to Lantena's room. She stood just inside the door, and took a moment to look around. This room used to be her room before her father had died. She'd been banished to the kitchen. It was the warmest room in the house, with sunlight pouring through the window and pink-flowered wallpaper. Lantena had redecorated almost everything else, so that there was very little left that Shauna recognized as her own. It was no longer the safe haven it had been for her. She pushed away the feelings of resentment and sadness that overcame her, and tiptoed to the closet. She opened it carefully, knowing how to angle the door so that it didn't creak and make her presence known. Once the closet was open, Shauna started going through the coat hangers with dresses, leafing through them like the thick pages of a book. She recognized some of the dresses, since she'd seen them in the shop windows when she'd gone to look out of boredom. Unfortunately, most of the dresses were fairly new. They were glorious, and it shot a pang of envy through Shauna's chest. She missed living a life of luxury, where she never had to worry about her next meal and where it would come from. She wouldn't have to count the days until winter to know how long she had before she would have to combat the cold, in addition to starvation either. There were no dresses in the closet that Shauna felt she could take without Lantana noticing. No doubt the girls were out now buying new dresses for the ball, but she didn't want to take the chance. Instead, she closed the closet door and left Lantana's room, creeping across the hallway to Daria's. Her closet was a bit bigger than Lantana's, but she had fewer to choose from. One of them, a blue dress that was decidedly different from the others, was one Shauna was willing to take a chance on, and she carefully took it off the coat hanger. She crept out of the room, the dress slung over her arm, and started toward the guest bedroom where she'd climbed through the window. As she did, she heard the door downstairs open, and Valerie's voice sound loudly. "Helena, I forgot my purse. Get it at once." Helena was the name of a maid Shauna didn't recognize. Oh shit. What do I do? Footsteps were heard as the maid ran up the stairs to retrieve Valerie's purse. A moment later, the maid appeared around the corner, nearly running over Shauna, who had frozen in shock that Valerie had returned so soon. Helena spotted her, her eyes going wide, then she started screaming. "Oh no no no. What's going on up there?" Valerie called, and another set of footsteps could be heard. "Hush, be quiet," Shauna hissed, trying to stop the maid from screaming murder. But Helena continued. Shauna dropped the dress and summoned her magic. She didn't know what she was going to do, she just needed the maid to be quiet, and for Valerie not to see her. At first, she tried to make herself invisible. She wasn't very good at it, and in her panic she failed completely. She threw some more magic at the maid, trying to make her stop. Water poured from the ceiling, drenching them both. Shauna and the maid both gasped in shock at the icy water. Why couldn't the water have been warm at least? Valerie was still coming, and Shauna was scared. She turned around and tried to hightail it out of there. She should have run instead of trying to use magic from the start, but she hadn't thought of that in her shock. "What the hell are you doing here?" she heard Valerie cry out as she made a run for the window, still carrying the dress. Shauna made it out of the window and started climbing down the plants that grew against the wall, but her foot slipped and she fell. As she did, she heard the material of the dress rip, and she winced, bracing for impact. When she hit the ground, all the air left her lungs and she couldn't breathe against the pain. "You thief!" she heard someone shout from inside. It could have been Daria or Lantana, they sounded the same. Shauna staggered to her feet and ran, still holding onto the dress. Just before she rounded the corner to the house, she ran into a wall of magic that slammed against her body and threw her backward. Valerie was onto her. "Come here, you vagrant," Valerie said, when she marched to Shauna, who lay on the ground gasping for air once more. How had Valerie gotten outside so fast? She grabbed Shauna by the arm and yanked her to her feet. Shauna's head spun after the impact, and she tried to think straight but she couldn't. Around them, the earth started trembling. The house hummed and vibrated, and Shauna's hands were hot, her palms burning. "What are you doing?" Valerie cried out, letting go of Shauna and throwing her arms out to the sides to keep her balance. "I'm not doing it," Shauna shouted to be heard above the rumbling coming from the earth far beneath their feet. But she knew what she'd said wasn't true. It was her magic that was pulling and tugging at the world around them. Magic that was more powerful than anything she'd ever felt before. And was completely out of control. "Stop it," Valerie shouted. "I'm trying." Shauna tried to reel her magic back in, but it wouldn't listen. It was as if it had taken on a life of its own. The dress she held in her hand suddenly caught fire, flames consuming the material and dancing along Shauna's skin. "No!" she shouted, dropping the dress and stomping on it to put the fire out. But the fire kept burning, and before long, the blue material had turned to a pile of smoking ash. The earth had stopped trembling, and Shauna stared down at the ruined dress, the smoke and tears stinging her eyes. When she looked up at Valerie, the woman was staring at Shauna with fear etched into her features. "Get away from me, you sorceress," she shouted. "Sorceress? I'll call the authorities," Valerie threatened, but her voice trembled and fear was clear in her eyes. Shauna didn't know what was happening. Her magic had gotten out of control, and now Valerie, with all her powerful magic, feared her. And she feared herself. She looked down at the dress one more time before she turned and fled. As she ran, tears streamed down her cheeks. She had no dress for the ball, and her magic that only a few days ago was a little unstable, was now terrifying in its power. Chapter 12. Shauna made it all the way to her shelter before she gave in to the panic, and began shaking and trembling. She'd always had magic, and when she was younger, her father had employed someone to teach her how to use it. But that had been a long time ago, and she hadn't been powerful enough to do anything serious since then. Not like what had just happened at the house. The worst part had been her lack of control. That terrified her. She'd never been in a situation where she lost all control, and her power had never been so strong that she caused such damage. She thought about the dress and her heart sank, fresh tears fell from her eyes. She covered her face and let her emotions pour out, allowing herself a moment to fall apart. When her sobs finally ceased, Shauna pulled herself back together again, wiping away her tears. She couldn't afford to come undone and stay that way. No one was there to look out for her, and if she was somehow incapable of doing it herself, she was going to die. Survival had been the most important thing to her, since the moment she'd left her father's house a year ago. She simply couldn't give up now. After a few moments, she tried to regain confidence in what she was doing. Shauna started thinking about the things that needed to be put in place for her plan to save her father's house to succeed. Going to the ball had been the most important next step. If she couldn't speak to the king, it didn't matter what she did, her father's house would be sold, and she would be stuck living her life on the streets. She wanted to live the life she'd had once before. She wanted her father back too, but that was impossible. But to keep the house would keep his memory alive. There was no way her father would have wanted for Shauna to lose everything. The problem was the dress. It was ruined now. There was no way she going to be able to go back to get another one. No doubt, Valerie would make sure there was always someone on the lookout for her now. Even if Shauna could sneak into the house again, she knew that the sisters would have made arrangements for their dresses to be hidden away, or spelled shut so that Shauna couldn't reach them. Getting caught had ruined her chances. She had no money. Buying a new dress, or even a second-hand one, wasn't going to work. The only other thing she could think of was to talk to Blaze. She knew it was a long shot, but it was her last hope. After pulling herself together enough that she didn't look like she was on the verge of falling apart anymore, Shauna left her shelter and made her way through the city. She was more on her guard than ever before, always looking over her shoulder to make sure that she wasn't being followed and the authorities weren't looking out for her. She knew that Valerie feared her now after her chaotic display of magic, but that didn't mean she wouldn't alert the guards. What if they were all looking out for her now, and it was only a matter of time before she was arrested and locked up? If that happened, everything would be over. Or worse. Shauna tried not to think about it too hard as she made her way toward the town square where the shops lined the streets. Blaze was in the shop when she arrived, and after studying the interior through the windows for a short while, Shauna decided his master had to be away on his business trip still. "Shauna," Blaze said, looking concerned when she walked in through the doors. "Are you all right?" She wasn't sure what he saw on her features that prompted him to ask, but she was intent on telling him that she was perfectly fine. She opened her mouth to speak, but tears suddenly rolled down her cheeks without warning. Damn it, she hadn't meant to come to him crying. She didn't want to pressure him into doing anything. It was tough all around, even for people with jobs and homes like Blaze. Come tell me what happened, Blaze said, offering Shauna a seat in the staff room. Is it okay for me to be here? She asked. She didn't want to get Blaze in trouble. It is for now. My master returns tonight, we have orders for the upcoming ball and we need all hands on deck. But until then you're safe. Shauna nodded, grateful for the reprieve. She started telling Blaze about the power that had gotten out of control, and how terrifying it had been. While she talked, Blaze frowned at her. I don't know what's going on, Shauna finally said. It's never been like this. Have you ever struggled with control at all? He asked. Shauna started shaking her head, but then she thought about it. Not to this point, no. But sometimes. It's never serious, but something it feels like I can't summon my magic at all. And sometimes it doesn't do what I ask of it. But nothing like this. Blaze thought about it for a moment. Why? Shauna asked when he wouldn't say anything. I think it's because of the life you choose to live, Blaze finally said. What does that mean? Shauna asked. You steal for a living. You broke into Valerie's home, and you took things from her. Shauna frowned. That house should have been mine. But it's not, Blaze pointed out. At least not yet. And until it is, you were trespassing. Shauna sighed. Blaze was right. She knew that. So because I'm not doing the right thing, I lose control. Blaze nodded. Yeah. I think you're using your magic for the wrong things, and it's turning into unseelie magic. Shauna gasped. What is that supposed to mean? You can't tell me I'm suddenly evil just because I'm trying to survive. She bristled at the thought that Blaze was saying she was unseelie. You're using your power for the wrong things, Shauna. How does that make you seelie? A lot of people use it for the wrong things, she protested. Blaze didn't argue with her, he only gave her a pointed look. The anger at his statement had replaced her sorrow, and her tears had dried up. At least that was a good thing, however. Shauna wasn't happy about how she'd achieved her new state. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to get her emotions under control. She needed to ask Blaze a favor, a big one, and she needed to do it now before it was too late. Her time was running out. Blaze? I know you're going to be very busy with the preparations for the ball, and all the dresses that need to be made. Do you have something I can use? A dress, even if it's an old one? Or something, anything? Blaze shook his head sadly. I can't let you take any of the dresses, Shauna. I'll bring it back, she said. I know you will, Blaze said. But if my master finds out, I'll lose my job. I can't afford that. I need to be able to earn money, and my master knows everything. Shauna wanted to protest and convince Blaze to help her, but she knew she wasn't going to be able to. Blaze needed to take care of himself first and foremost, and even though she was resentful, a sudden emotion she hadn't felt before toward him, she wasn't going to do anything to get him in trouble. Thank you, she finally said, and stood. Are you sure you don't want to stay a little longer? Blaze asked. Shauna shook her head. Her mood was getting blacker by the second, and she had to figure something out before it was too late to go to the ball, and her life would never get better. She made her way back to her shelter, trudging through the familiar back alleys, keeping her eyes down, shoulders hunched and almost defeated. She didn't even check to see if the authorities were around, and looking for her. If they wanted to catch her now. Shauna realized quickly that she had to snap out of it, and pull herself together. There was just no point wallowing right now. She had to stay on top of life and keep motivated. There must be a way. But how? She couldn't think anymore. She just had to be home. When she reached her shelter, Shauna opened the small box in which she kept the locket from her mother. She held the locket in her hand, looking at the worn silver. She ran her fingers over the gemstones that were intricately molded into the silver, creating a design that was akin to stained glass. An image of a family, with a father and a mother and a child, all connected to each other. Her mother had never taken it off, and in it was a photo of Shauna when she was a child, and a photo of her father. Shauna opened the locket and looked at the pictures, running her thumb over her father's face. She missed him so much it hurt. She ached for the life she used to have with him. When her mother had passed away, she'd been very young and she didn't remember much of her. But her father and her had been inseparable until the day he died, and Shauna wished she could have him back. The locket was precious, she knew that. Not only because of the memories it held, but because of the precious stones that were encrusted along the outside. Shauna had struggled a lot with getting food and warmth, and it had been difficult to find a shelter that was safe. But she would never give her most valuable possession. This was one thing Valerie wasn't able to take from her. This was one thing the world wasn't able to take from her. And not once had she been willing to give up the locket in exchange for money. She had been set on surviving without selling it off. She couldn't give up the last thing she had of her parents. However, the thought now crosses her mind. If her father's house might be sold from under her, Shauna started to wonder if it was something she needed to do. It would be awful to lose the locket, but if it would mean that she could get her home back and return to the life of nobility, it might just be worth it. Short-term loss for long-term gain. Shauna was so conflicted. Selling the locket made her chest ache and tears run down her cheeks. She had cried a lot in the past while, and she felt weak for it. But she couldn't stop herself. Just thinking about losing the locket tore Shauna apart. She didn't want to do it. But if she didn't, she might lose everything else. She knew that shouldn't decide tonight. Her mind was racing and compromised. So she placed the locket back in its box, and tucked it under the blankets she always slept on. She would think about it more tomorrow. She needed to sleep on it. Eventually, she'd know what she needed to do. Right now, she was too vulnerable to make that decision. Chapter 13. Shauna was caught in a deep sleep, a sleep that dragged her deep down into darkness and wouldn't let her go. At first she'd welcomed sleep. It had been wonderful to escape from what was happening in her life, right now. But after a while, Shauna started to feel like something was wrong. When she wanted to open her eyes, she felt like her power was keeping her under, and she was stuck in the darkness even when she wasn't asleep anymore. Shauna started fighting to wake up, and realized that it was magic that kept her down in the black. Magic from someone else? She started to panic, breathing hard, her heart rate climbing. Who was here? Who had caught her? Had the authorities found her? It took a while for Shauna to calm her breathing and focus on what she felt. And when she finally did, she realized it wasn't the power of someone else. She was alone in her shelter, she was sure of it. It was her own magic that was trying to bring her under. Her own magic was drowning her in darkness. The idea that she had lost control again made her panic anew, and the more she panicked and tried to fight, the heavier and worse it became. Again Shauna tried to calm herself, but this time it was her magic she tried to control. Slowly, painstakingly so, she managed to get the better of the power. It felt like it took forever, but finally she managed to open her eyes and blink against the bright sunlight that fell into the shelter. She pushed herself up on her blankets and rags and rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the dregs of sleep that still clung to her. Fear curled in the pit of her stomach. Her power was getting away from her, and it was terrifying. She thought about what Blaze had said, that it was because her intentions were bad. She didn't know if that was true, but he knew these things, so part of her was willing to trust that he was right. There was no way for Shauna to change what she was doing. She had no other way to survive but to steal her way through life. But if she could pull this one last thing off, if she could make it to the palace and speak to the king, if she could convince him to decree that she got back her father's house, then everything would change. Everything would be good again. Then she wouldn't lose control, and she wouldn't be in danger anymore. And she wouldn't have to struggle to survive. It was hard to believe that so much rode on her being able to speak to the king. What if the king didn't want to speak to her once she was there? Or listen to her plea and rule that her father's house be awarded to her? What if this was all for nothing? It was a risk she had to take. If she did nothing, her life wouldn't change. If she went and it didn't work, it would be devastating. But there was a chance it would work, and that was what she had to focus on. She had to trust her gut that this would work. She had to hold on to hope. Shauna prepared breakfast, although it was closer to lunchtime, and ate. While she ate, her mind wandered. What was she going to do? How was she going to find a dress? The only way she could think of doing it was by selling the locket for enough money to buy one, and hoped that it all worked out. Although, it was difficult to imagine parting with the locket. It was something Shauna had been holding on to for years and years, and to let it go would cause heartache, she was sure of it. Suddenly, the sound of someone outside drew Shauna's attention back to the present. She swallowed down the lump of stale bread she'd been chewing on, and jumped to her feet. She crept to the opening of her shelter, and looked through the two tarps. Right outside stood none other than Valerie, in her high-end fashion, dress overflowing, shoes to make your toes bleed. Shauna hated that Valerie's life didn't change one bit after her father had died. "I know you're in there, Shauna," Valerie said. "I come in peace." Shauna frowned and pushed the tarp aside, stepping into the bright sunlight. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Valerie shrugged her shoulders. "I came to bury the hatchet." Shauna narrowed her eyes. She couldn't trust Valerie for one moment. Valerie had never cared about her relationship with Shauna, and she had never tried to make things right. "How did you find me?" Shauna asked. Valerie laughed. "You leave a trail of magic behind you as far as you go. Not everyone can follow it, but I did. I'm not a fool, Shauna. I know that your magic has changed. I understand that you're waging a war." It wasn't what Shauna had been doing at all. It was worrisome that Valerie had been able to find her without difficulty, but she believed her when she said that not many would be able to do the same. What bothered her the most was that Valerie seemed to think that her power meant something other than what Shauna was really trying to achieve. "I'm not trying to fight with you," Shauna said, and she meant it. Although Valerie had ripped away everything important to her, she didn't wish her ill. All Shauna wanted was what was owed to her. She wanted the life her father would have wanted for her. Valerie had taken that away from her, and that was what Shauna resented. "I don't believe you," Valerie said. "And I'm not going to allow you to come to my house any longer, and to look for trouble with my daughters." "So?" "I wasn't looking for trouble," Shauna interrupted. "So," Valerie continued, putting emphasis on the word, "I'm going to make you an offer you cannot refuse, one that will end this between us once and for all." "What offer?" Shauna asked, curious despite her suspicions of what Valerie truly wanted. "I am willing to pay you a handsome sum of money for you to let go of this nonsense." "I don't want your money," Shauna said immediately. "Don't be a fool, Shauna. I know you live in squalor. With money you can look after yourself, and you won't have to live in these." She scrunched her nose at the shelter behind Shauna and waved her hand. "Conditions. You can take care of yourself, find something better. Will you give me enough, so that I can live the life I lived before?" Valerie snorted. "Don't be ridiculous. But take what I'm offering you. It won't come again, Shauna. It's now or never." Shauna considered what Valerie was offering. Money? Shauna would be able to build a life for herself, and even though it wouldn't be what she'd had before, it would be better than this. And if her attempt at speaking to the king failed, Shauna would have nothing at all. Something would be so much better than what she had now. For a moment, Shauna wanted to accept it. If she could make an honest living, she could gain control of her magic again, and it wouldn't be so unstable. Maybe she could even move to a different kingdom, and start over. Her mind flashed to Hansel. What if she could find him and live wherever he'd come from? But that would mean she would lose everything she was holding on to so dearly. Her father's house. The memories. And the life she used to live. She would give in, and Valerie would win. Valerie would get away with whatever she had done to cheat Shauna out of her inheritance. No, Shauna said tightly, her mind made up. What? Valerie asked, looking confused. You heard me. I don't want your money. You're being ridiculous, Valerie scolded as if Shauna was still a child in her care. You have the chance to turn your life around for the better. After what you've done to me and my daughters these past few days, you don't deserve any kindness from me, and yet here I am, offering you a way out. You're offering me a way out of what I deserve, Shauna clapped back. And I'm not going to accept it. I deserve so much more than the life you've allowed me to live. You were supposed to be a mother to me, to take care of me after my father died. Instead, you made my life hell, and now I'm supposed to believe you care about me. You just want to pay me off, so that I'll disappear. Valerie lifted her chin and looked down her nose. This is your last chance, you ungrateful little brat, she said haughtily. If I leave now, the offer leaves with me. Then you should go, Shauna said. I don't want to see you here ever again. Valerie laughed. Oh, you won't, don't worry. You won't see me at your father's house either. The sale is almost through, and once that happens we'll move, and your stalking in the bushes will be someone else's problem. Shauna's jaw dropped and Valerie cackled a laugh. Did you think I didn't know you were out there? I've been waiting for you to overstep the boundaries, so that I can put the authorities onto you. I didn't do it the last 2 times I've seen you, but mark my words, if I so much as see you in our street, I'm calling the authorities. She turned on her heel and walked away, climbing down the ladder with surprising ease considering the dress and shoes she wore. Shauna waited until Valerie was gone before she let out a breath and sank to the floor. She dropped her head into her hands. That had been too close. The idea of being able to buy food for a change, and maybe having a bed to sleep on instead of rags, had been so tempting. She had nearly signed away her rights to the life she deserved. But she wasn't going to do it. She just had to make her plan work. A few more days, and then it would all be over. Shauna wasn't quite sure which way it would go, but her time was running out. The clock was ticking, and soon the choice on which way her life would lead would be done. Chapter 14. Shauna stood at the edge of the marketplace. Valerie may have woken her up from her deep sleep despite its darkness, but she couldn't go back to sleep. So there she was, watching the merchants erect their stores, set out their goods and start the day of selling to the citizens of Vanborn. In her pocket, she thumbed the silver locket that burned her skin. She didn't want to sell it, the one piece of jewelry was all she had left of her previous life. But if she didn't, she was going to lose everything, and the locket would be the only thing she would ever have. Was it a gamble she was willing to take? Absolutely. Shauna knew that if she didn't do something now, she was forever doomed to live on the streets. She couldn't resort to that, no matter how painful it was to lose her most valuable piece. Shauna's mind was reeling. She needed to walk away for a moment. She had to push through the resentment. This wasn't fair at all. She looked up and squinted in the sunlight. Please forgive me, Father. When the jewelry store was finally ready, Shauna took a deep breath. She pulled her hand out of her pocket, with her fingers curled around the locket. It was now or never. Just as Valerie had said to her yesterday. If she didn't scrape together the courage to do it now, she would never bring herself to sell the locket, and then her chances would be squandered. Good morning, Shauna said politely. The jeweler looked at her, suspicion immediately crossing his features. It was the reaction Shauna always got from the stall owners when she came too close. They knew she often stole from the stalls, and they couldn't afford to lose anything. It was tough times for everyone. Good morning to you, the jeweler answered. I have something to sell, Shauna said. At that the jeweler's face lit up, the suspicion disappearing, replaced by curiosity. Everyone always needed money, and would never pass up a way to make it. Shauna knew that she wouldn't be offered the full price for the locket. The jeweler would probably pay her a fraction of what he would ask for it when a rich nobleman came past. But she had no other choice. Shauna opened up her hand and held it out to the jeweler. His eyes widened, and he took the precious locket from her, inspecting it closely. "What is your reason for selling?" he asked while he turned it around and around in his hand. "I need money," Shauna admitted. "I have nothing else of value to sell, this is my only hope." The jeweler frowned. "Where did you get this?" "From my mother," Shauna said. "I didn't steal it." The jeweler shook his head. "I'm not asking because I think you're a thief. I'm asking because this locket is very special. You shouldn't sell it." "It is very special to me," Shauna agreed. "But I have no choice." The jeweler shook his head. "I'm a fool for turning this down, but you can't part ways with it. This locket will change your life, you just have to acknowledge its existence." Shauna narrowed her eyes, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means that you're holding on to something very valuable, something that will change the direction you're moving in forever. If you get rid of it, you'll pass up the opportunity to have the life you deserve." Shauna blinked at the jeweler. The life she deserved. It was exactly what she always thought. How could it be that he was saying the same words? "I don't understand," Shauna said. The jeweler handed the locket back to her and shook his head. "I can't make you see, but it will be a mistake for you to get rid of that. Hold on to it, let it do what it's meant to do. I can't buy it from you." "But I really need the money. Please, I'll take anything." "I beg you, please take it," Shauna cried out. It was the day of the ball, and she had nothing to wear. If she didn't have a dress by tonight, she wasn't going to be able to see the king at all. "Well then, you're going to have to find someone else to take it from you. It's not going to be me. I'm sorry." Shauna stared at the jeweler, shocked that he would turn something so valuable down. She felt betrayed, in a way. How could he turn her down? How could he say no? The jeweler promptly turned his back on Shauna, his message across loud and clear. She blinked at his back in shock once or twice before she stepped away from the store, tears welling up. She looked around the marketplace, but she knew full well that he was the only jeweler there. Perhaps she could go to the shop that was close to where Blaze worked, but she knew that the jeweler was the upmarket one, and wouldn't buy her jewelry from her. There was a reason she hadn't gone there in the first place. With her heart in her shoes, Shauna made her way back to her shelter. What was she going to do now? Everything around her was failing. She didn't know what else to do. She sat down and tried to think of another way out. Surely if she wanted it badly enough, she could find a way. But there was nothing. A lump rose in her throat and the tears started falling. Shauna didn't try to swallow it down. There was no use, this was it, the end of her line. This was where she had to admit defeat. She closed her eyes, bowed her head, and tears rolled over her cheeks. She started sobbing, allowing herself to fall apart without any plans of putting herself back together again. She held her mother's locket in her hands, and her tears ran over it. Suddenly a bright light filled the shelter, and Shauna cowered away from it. A moment later, a woman appeared in front of her. Floating with a white flowing dress, with long grey hair that hung over her shoulders. No, the hair was silver. She had kind eyes and a warm smile. "What's wrong, child?" she asked. "Who are you?" Shauna blinked up at the woman. "Where did you come from?" "Why, child, I am your guardian. When your tears fell onto your locket, I came for you." Shauna frowned. That sounds like a fairy tale in a children's book. The woman laughed and the sound was pleasant, dancing around Shauna like chimes in the breeze. "Perhaps. Stories are often told about people like me. But I can assure you, I'm no fairy tale. I'm just as real as the magic that courses through your veins. I was assigned to you the moment this locket came into your family. It's my job to take care of you." Shauna jumped to her feet, anger surging in her heart. "But I don't understand. I've been suffering for a long time. Where were you then? When my mother died, and my father was struggling to raise a little girl by himself? Where were you when my father died? or when I was banished to the kitchen, like a servant, or when I had to run away from the only home I've ever known, because my life had become unbearable. Why weren't you there for me then? The woman's face fell. I wanted to be there for you. I can't escape the locket unless I'm called. And your tears called me today. Shauna shook her head. It seemed surreal that this woman was in front of her. What are you doing here? Shauna asked, sounding more defeated than a moment ago when anger had overcome her. I'm here to help you, child. The ball is tonight, isn't it? And you need something to wear. Shauna blinked at the stranger. I don't understand how you can help me, Shauna admitted. The whole plan is lost. It's never lost, child, the woman said. We have everything we need. Do we? Shauna asked. She tilted her head to the side a little, then shook her head. No, you're right. We don't quite have everything. But it will be easy enough to find. I need you to go to the marketplace and find a few things to bring back to me. Shauna was eager to do the woman's bidding. Her guardian, her Fae godmother it seemed, was truly here to help her. I'm going to need a pumpkin, the Fae said. What? Shauna asked. It sounded ridiculous. The Fae nodded. Yes, and mice. 4 of them. 2 lizards if you can, and… Well, I think that will do. Shauna shook her head. It sounds a bit cliché, don't you think? Where am I supposed to find those things? The Fae smiled. I know you've been scraping to get by. I know you have the resources to find these things. Go on, I'll be here when you get back. Shauna's guardian lowered to the ground and arranged herself on the rags and blankets, and Shauna realized that the Fae was being serious. She was sending Shauna out on an errand to find the strangest objects. But Shauna wasn't going to fight her. Clearly, she knew what she was talking about. Shauna had run out of other options, and this was her last but strange hope. She was going to do exactly as she was told. After all, she had nothing left to lose. The mice were fairly easy to find. Shauna knew exactly where to look, behind the bakery where the excess grains were often tossed. The mice went there to find food. Shauna had gone there once or twice too. The mice were easy to catch, after they had eaten as much as they possibly could. Lizards were more difficult to catch. In the middle of the day they sat in the sun, but were quick on their feet. Still, it only took a few tries before Shauna had managed to catch 2 of them. She found a toad too. The Fae hadn't requested one, but Shauna was going to take her anything she might need. Lastly, Shauna had to work on getting her hands on a pumpkin. That proved to be a little harder. Shauna had never stolen a pumpkin because they were large and difficult to squirrel away when someone wasn't looking. She was going to have to get creative with this one. The vegetable stall was manned by an older woman named Mrs. Bailey. She was very serious about her vegetables, always telling the customers in great detail how she grew them and how she got him to be so big. Shauna hadn't often paid attention to Mrs. Bailey's routine. It had always seemed crazy to try and steal from her. But today Shauna watched her closely, hiding behind crates. She realized very quickly that Mrs. Bailey seemed to have a weak bladder. Whenever she drank something, which was quite often, she had to relieve herself not long after. But she was never away for very long, and that would make things more complicated. Shauna wouldn't have the time to take one of the big pumpkins and carry it away before Mrs. Bailey returned. Shauna turned the matter over in her mind and finally decided on a different approach. She summoned her magic. Since the day she had lost control as her father's house, she had been wary of accessing her magic. Shauna had been terrified of losing control again. But now she had to risk it. She didn't use her weather magic, which she was the most comfortable with. It wouldn't help her in this situation. Instead, she focused on her power of levitation. She had used it a couple of times to lift herself onto buildings or into trees, to get away from the authorities or to find a shelter, but she had rarely tried to lift something else. Now, Shauna concentrated all her power on the vegetables that were stacked on the table. At first nothing happened. Then, slowly, the pumpkin started trembling in its spot. Before long, lots of vegetables started floating, one by one, gliding into the air as if gravity had been turned off. Mrs. Bailey gasped and tried to grab them, trying to bring them back. At first it was only a few things. A small bunch of carrots, and some strawberries that seemed to float by Mrs. Bailey's head. But very soon all the vegetables were flying about, making it impossible for Mrs. Bailey to go after each one of them. Shauna focused hard on the vegetables, trying to keep them all in the air. While she did, she put her attention to the large pumpkin that was still seated on the table. She was going to have to keep the other vegetables in the air, keeping Mrs. Bailey distracted, while she brought the pumpkin over to where she was hiding. It wasn't going to be easy, and sure enough, the pumpkin didn't float. Instead, it rolled over the table in Shauna's direction. It was better than nothing, and Shauna decided to go with it. As long as the other vegetables distracted Mrs. Bailey, maybe Shauna could pull it off. When the pumpkin rolled off the table, Shauna winced, terrified it was going to break. But by some miracle, it stayed in one piece, and continued to roll down the cobbled road, heading toward the crates where Shauna was hiding. 2 customers jumped over the pumpkin, startled by it rolling down the road as if it had a will of its own. When the pumpkin was close enough to Shauna that she could drag it across the floor behind the crates, she let go of the vegetables she'd been keeping in the air. Her head ached after the exertion, and she heard Mrs. Bailey yelp and cry out as all the vegetables fell to the table in one giant wave. Shauna felt guilty that she might have bruised some of Mrs. Bailey's vegetables, and she felt terrible that she'd stolen her prized pumpkin that she'd been bragging about recently. But if this plan worked, Shauna would make sure she made it up to Mrs. Bailey, and would order fruit and vegetables from her for the rest of her days. Shauna hoisted the pumpkin onto her shoulder, groaning under the weight when she stood, but she found her feet and headed back to the shelter. Chapter 15. When Shauna arrived back at the shelter with her newly found bizarre items, the Fae grinned broadly. "I wish I was there to see how you did it," she said with a laugh. Shauna frowned. "Haven't you been keeping an eye on me? Wasn't that how you knew everything about my life?" The Fae shook her head. "Not when you're doing something wrong. I can't see the things that aren't in line with your magic." Another wave of guilt passed over her. She'd been doing a lot of things that weren't in line with her magic. Impure things, Blaze had called them. "Well," Shauna said, "I brought everything you need. Now what?" "Now the fun begins," the Fae announced, and she lifted her hands. "This is my favorite part," she added in an excited whisper. She hovered her hands over the pumpkin, and Shauna watched as the vegetables started to tremble. "Oh no!" the Fae cried out. "Not here, or we'll be in trouble. Come, we must go down to the street." "We can't," Shauna said, shaking her head. "We'll be discovered down there. Trust me, child, you're going to want this to happen in the streets." She disappeared, and a moment later she called up from the street. "Are you coming?" Shauna hadn't realized she would be so fast, and she scrambled down the ladder that brought her down from the roof. As soon as they were in the street with the pumpkin, mice, lizards and all, the Fae held her hand out over the pumpkin again. Again it started to tremble on the ground, then rattled and danced, and as Shauna watched, the pumpkin started to change. At first it looked bizarre, changing shape as though it was trying to break free. But then it took on a different shape entirely. In fact, it looked like Was that a moment later, with a popping sound, cars stood in the street where the pumpkin had been. "What is this?" Shauna asked. The Fae blinked at the car. "If you don't know what this is, we are going to have a lot more trouble than I thought." Shauna shook her head. "I know it's a car, I'm just trying to figure out where it came from." "You brought me a pumpkin, dear," the Fae said matter-of-factly. "A good one too. You could have had a terrible piece of work, but this car looks grand." Shauna had to agree. It was sleek and black, with polished chrome wheels and tinted windows. "What else did you bring me?" the Fae asked. Shauna handed her the container with mice, lizards and the frog. "Oh dear, this won't do," the Fae said. What? Shauna asked, alarmed. Did I get the wrong ones? No. This is exactly what I asked for, the Fae said with a laugh. But the last time I did this, I created a carriage, not a car. Different hero, child. Back then I needed coachmen. Now all we need is a single driver. Shauna blinked at the Fae. She'd done this before. Let the mice and the lizards go, I think the frog will be just fine. Shauna did as the Fae asked, and put the mice and the lizards down on the cobblestones. They ran across the street and disappeared. The sun was starting to set. It had taken Shauna a while to get everything together. All right, big boy, the Fae said to the frog. Let's see what you've got. She held her hands over the frog and closed her eyes. As Shauna watched, the frog started to squirm. And then it started to grow. At first it kept its shape, but slowly it started to change. For a moment it looked like a strange pimply monster, with rubbery skin and bulging eyes. But then, with the same pop the pumpkin had given, the frog slipped into the shape of a man. Granted, the man had a pot belly, a bald head, and his eyes were still a little bulging. But he looked nothing like a frog. My lady, he said, and bowed from the waist to Shauna and the Fae. I am at your service. The Fae clapped her hands like a child, laughing excitedly. It's been too long since I've used my magic like this, she said. Oh, how fun. Shauna shook her head, struggling to believe what she was seeing. Well, you've got your ride to the palace, they're not going to stop you at the gate when you arrive in this. And the driver has the invitation in his pockets. I thought everyone was invited, Shauna argued. The flyer? Everyone is invited, the Fae agreed. But the king sent personal invites to a lot of ladies in town, and if you have one of those, it will give you more credibility. Shauna couldn't believe how thorough the Fae was. The jeweler had been right, the locket and the Fae, they were changing her life. He was another person on the long list of people Shauna would need to thank when this day was done. I don't have anything to wear, she pointed out. Wasn't that what the Fae had said she would give her in the first place? Shauna had never asked for a car, she hadn't even thought about it. Of course. Of course. The Fae tilted her head to the side and studied the clothes, no, the rags Shauna was wearing. Yes, that won't do at all. We'll just have to. She extended her hand to Shauna, and Shauna closed her eyes, waiting. At first nothing happened. She frowned and peeked at the Fae through one eye. Nothing is happening. Patience, child, the Fae scolded. This isn't the same as making a car, or a driver, you know. Shauna wasn't sure how it was any different, but she wasn't going to argue. This was the Fae's expertise, and she was going to let her do it. At first Shauna didn't feel anything, but then a strange warmth crept over her skin. It was so faint, Shauna thought she might be imagining it. But as the heat grew, she realized something was definitely happening. The heat soon enveloped her, and she could feel something tingles all around her. It was almost as if a blanket of heat that wrapped around her was alive, moving against her skin. She felt the clothes that she wore changing against her, stretching over her skin, turning from the rags that hung from her frame to something delicate, something featherlight. Something beautiful. It took some time before the warmth finally faded away, and Shauna kept her eyes closed, too scared to open them. The Fae chuckled melodiously. You can open your eyes now, child. Shauna waited, her breath catching in her throat. This was all too good to be true, surely? She opened her eyes, and when she glanced down at herself, she gasped. She was wearing a beautiful dress spun of pure gold. It was light around her when she moved, and it was frosted with crystals, embellishing the dress so that it looked like a fallen star. She touched her hand to her hair, and found that it had been pinned up elegantly. The Fae produced a mirror, as if she knew that Shauna wanted to know what she looked like. When Shauna looked into it, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She wore graceful makeup, her skin powdery and smooth, and her hair had been twisted intricately, pinned down with the same crystals that were on the dress. And she was clean. She couldn't believe it. The Fae had erased years of stress and filth from her skin. Her mother's locket hung perfectly from her neck, a nice touch, Shauna thought. Lastly, the Fae said, kneeling in front of Shauna. We have to make sure that you have shoes. She lifted the material of the skirt and touched Shauna's feet. A moment later, she felt the shoes grow around her feet. When she lifted the skirt of her dress and looked down, she wore shoes that looked like they were made of pure crystal. Oh, this is the most beautiful pair of shoes I have ever seen, Shauna exclaimed. The Fae smiled. I have to admit, I have outdone myself this time. I think I'm getting better at this, but you know what it is they say about practice. She winked at Shauna. You're going to have to leave now, child, or you'll miss the ball. Shauna nodded and walked toward the car. The driver opened the door for her and bowed from the waist. Thank you for everything, Shauna said when she climbed into the car, and the Fae nodded, looking at her with a smile. I've done my job, child, now it's time for you to do yours. But remember, the clothes don't make the man. Or the woman in your case. Shauna frowned and leaned through the open window. What do you mean? You may be dressed like royalty, but that doesn't mean that you are any more than the person I found when you were crying on that locket. Don't forget that. It's still up to you to change your fate. Shauna nodded. I'll remember, she said. She closed the window and the driver took off, speeding toward the castle. Chapter 16. The driver moved the sleek black car slowly through the streets, and Shauna looked through the tinted windows at the city gliding by. It was strange being in a car dressed to perfection and moving through the main roads. She saw parts of the city she rarely had the chance to see. Everything seemed to be shimmering and shining with grandeur and luxury. It was difficult to believe this was the same city Shauna had been trying to survive in for the past year. When they approached the palace gates, she held her breath. She hadn't made it this far before. Her mind flashed to Hansel, who had stopped her from approaching, and told her that she would be caught if she came close to the palace gate. When the driver was stopped at the gate, he made small talk with the guard, and they talked and laughed as if they were old friends. Not bad for a toad, Shauna thought with a giggle. A short while later, the driver produced an invitation, and the guard leaned into the car window and glanced at Shauna. Her heart jumped into her throat and she thought she was going to faint. What if he recognized her? What if he knew she didn't belong in such incredible clothes and an expensive car? What if she was arrested for being an imposter, or worse, for theft? But the guard nodded at the driver and waved them through, and the car drove around a large fountain, parking in front of steps that led to a giant door. We have arrived, madam, the driver said, glancing at Shauna in the rearview mirror with his strangely bulging eyes. Thank you, she said, and the driver climbed out to open the door for her. When she did, he leaned in. I must warn you, he said in a low voice. You are to return home before the clock strikes 12. What happens then? Shauna asked. Everything will return to what it once was, the dream will be over, and you will be recognized not as the nobility you arrived as tonight, but as the vagrant in the streets that should not be allowed past the palace gates. This Fae magic is not to be toyed with. Shauna nodded and thanked the driver. She looked up at the palace as the driver left, and 2 guards ushered her to move up the steps and toward the large doors. Music floated from inside, and Shauna's stomach tightened with nerves. So much could go wrong. Again, she worried she would be recognized. But the guards beckoned to her again, and she had no choice but to follow through with her plan. She was dressed the part after all, with her hair pinned up beautifully and the dress with its crystals swishing and shimmering around her legs. When she walked in through the wide doors, the guards led her to the ballroom. The music grew louder as she followed them, and then she appeared at the top of a set of stairs that led down into the ballroom. Couples were dancing to the music, and on the opposite balcony, looking down at the dances, sat the king himself. Relief coursed through her. She was going to be able to speak to him, after all. She just had to find a way to get to him, and not end up on the dance floor. I see you took my advice and dressed for the occasion before trying to get into the palace, a voice said next to her, and Shauna jolted. What? She asked. I'm sure I don't know what you're. Her voice trailed off when she saw who was talking to her. Hansel smiled at her with perfect teeth and eyes so brightly violet it was mesmerizing. Shauna swallowed hard. She would have to be careful around this man, lest she fall into those eyes forever. She shook herself and focused on his word. Hansel, what are you doing here? His white hair had been pulled back from his face, hanging down his back in a beautiful braid. He wore a powder blue suit that seemed to have been tailor-made by the very best. The material shimmered beneath the lights, and the black shoes he wore were polished so shiny, Shauna could see her reflection in them. He looked perfectly dashing and like he belonged. Which didn't seem right. But then, Shauna knew she looked like she belonged too. And she didn't. I'm enjoying my party, he said, gesturing his hand to the crowd. Shauna shook her head, confused. I don't understand what you mean. A guard approached. It's time for you to be introduced, my lord. My lord? What was going on? The Princess Ariana, Hansel said to the guard. The music died down, and the couples stopped dancing on the dance floor. They all turned to look up at the stairs where Shauna and he stood. A moment later, the guard announced them. Prince Hansel of Vanborn and Princess Ariana. The couples on the dance floor, as well as the onlookers around the edges of the ballroom, all bowed deeply. Shauna gasped for breath. Hansel held out his arm. No. I'm not. I know exactly who you are, Shauna, Hansel said softly. But you don't want him to announce your real name, do you? Shauna shook her head. Somewhere down there were Valerie, Lantana and Daria. Shauna didn't want them to know she was there. She didn't want anyone to recognize her from the alleys either. Come on, they're expecting us, Hansel said. In a daze, Shauna rested her hand on Hansel's arm, and they descended the stairs together. Her head spun as she watched the crowd, saw them whispering to each other. Are they on to us? She asked under her breath. No, they're jealous that I'm escorting you, not any of them. I've been refusing dances all evening. But I think I'm ready to take the floor now. Shauna looked at Hansel, appalled. I'm not here to dance. It would be strange for you not to, he said with a devilish grin. Since I'm escorting you and everything. And you don't say no to the prince. Shauna glared at Hansel. You're not really the prince, are you? They reached the dance floor and Hansel turned to Shauna. He placed one hand on her waist and took her other hand in his. The music started, and he led her on the dance floor. Her feet seemed to know where to go, which was lucky, as Shauna did not. But you can't be the prince, Shauna said when she realized she was dancing and she wasn't recognized by all the eyes that were on her. Why not? Do you think I bribed the guards to call me the Prince of Vanborn? Shauna didn't think that was possible, but it made no sense. How then did I meet you in the marketplace? Or at my shelter? Hansel chuckled, and Shauna stared into his eyes, his deep voice caressing her skin. That same tension that was always there between them began to build up once more. She had to admit that she loved being this close to him. The way he pulled her nearer to him with his hand around her waist made her feel wanted, desired. Sometimes I try to escape from the palace life and all its expectations, he said, answering her question. Meeting you has been the fresh breath of air I needed. Shauna didn't know what to say. Her mind spun with how ludicrous it seemed. She had no idea how it had happened that she'd met the prince. But now that she was in this position, she could get what she wanted. Will you take me to speak to your father? She asked. It's a matter of urgency. Hansel narrowed his eyes at her. Why do you need to speak to my father? I was trying to before, if you recall, she said tightly. It's a matter of urgency. A family emergency. My father won't see anyone tonight, Hansel said, and Shauna's heart sank. The only reason she'd come to the ball was so that she could speak to the king without having to be presented by a noble. Then all of this was for nothing, she said sadly, dropping her head in defeat. I don't think it was for nothing, Hansel said, letting go of her waist to capture her chin and lift her face back to him. You look fantastic, and we're having a good time. Take it for what it is and enjoy the evening with me. Shauna nodded mutely. She'd been so set on speaking to the king, it was hard to push past the lump of disappointment lodged in her chest. But Hansel was here, and despite her worries, she felt the attraction to him grow. After a few dances together, Hansel suggested they leave the ballroom for fresh air. They walked outside and onto a large balcony. The music was behind them, and in the cool night air, Shauna felt like she could breathe again. It had been too hot, cloying in the extreme with all those people around. Hansel leaned against the balcony and studied Shauna's face for so long, a blush crept onto her cheeks. "What?" he asked shyly. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "You are the most beautiful fae I've ever seen," Hansel said. Shauna blushed even harder, her cheeks practically exploding with heat. "That can't be true. I'm nothing more than a vagrant." "I didn't say I was attracted to your class, Shauna. I'm attracted to you. You look incredible, but something about you've drawn my attention from the start and you won't let go." Before Shauna could say anything, Hansel moved closer. She turned towards him, and looked up into his eyes, unsure of what he was going to say, but loving the fact that instead of being inside with all those dozens of ladies, he was out here with her. And the very best part about that, he knew who she really was. Or at least, who she'd become. He leaned forward slowly, and she tilted her head up to meet him. He kissed her, his lips gentle on hers. She let her eyes close and sighed into his embrace. His hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers under her hair. Shauna's breath caught in her throat when he kissed her deeper, spearing apart her lips and letting his tongue dance inside her mouth. Pleasure ricocheted through her body, and she all but melted into him. Kissing Hansel made the rest of the world fall away, and all her worries. All but one. When Hansel finally broke the kiss and lifted his head to stare down at her, she pressed her lips together for a single moment, savoring the taste of him on her lips. But it was time to break the spell. None of this would last unless she was put back into her proper place in life. "I really do need to speak to the king, Hansel." He frowned. "I understand." "You do?" He nodded. "I can't help you with my father tonight, but he will hear you tomorrow morning. And I will be the one to present you. Stay with me." Shauna shook her head. "I can't. After midnight the spell will fall away, and I will just be me again. And then the king would not see her, and surely Hansel would not vouch for her. Not once she was in her rags once more." Hansel lifted his hand and brushed a stray hair from Shauna's face. "I know who you are, and that's all that matters. I'll protect you." Shauna stared at him. Was that really possible? That the man she'd met in the market, the prince, would stand by her? Before she could say anything else, Hansel kissed her again. This time Shauna gave in to the feelings and wrapped her arms around his neck. Never in her life had she felt so connected to someone, like she belonged with them. She hadn't kissed many men before, but this was different somehow. The same heat Shauna had come to associate with Hansel washed over her again, and pleasure unfurled at her core. She wanted more than just kissing. She wanted to be joined to Hansel in a way she had never experienced before. "Come with me to my chambers where we can be alone," Hansel said when he pulled back and stared down at her, lust in his eyes. Shauna blinked up at him. "I know it seems forward, Shauna," he said. "But I desire you, and my magic tells me you desire me too." She couldn't argue with that, and she didn't want to. For once, she wanted to feel loved. She wanted to feel desired. She wanted to feel good. And with Hansel she felt all those things, and she didn't want those feelings to end. Shauna swallowed hard. "I'd like that," she managed to say, and Hansel took her hand and led her away. Her heart was racing in her chest, but she clung tight to his hand as they moved through the palace, stepping into quiet rooms where the music from the party could only be dimly heard. No one was around to see them, and a short while later, Hansel led Shauna into a large, beautifully decorated bedroom. He closed two tall doors behind him and turned to Shauna. "These are my quarters and we won't be bothered here," he said. She nodded, breathless now. Part of her believed this had to be a dream. The whole night must be. She must have fallen and hit her head or something, but she couldn't believe that the Prince of Van Born wanted to take her into his bed. He stepped closer to Shauna yet again, and cupped her face before he kissed her. Her magic unfurled inside of her, as if awoken by Hansel's closeness. This was good. This was right. She sighed against him as he kissed her, and his power wrapped around her, cocooning them in magic that seemed to push away the rest of the world. Hansel's hand slid from her cheeks down her neck, onto the bare skin of her shoulders. She shivered under his touch. He kissed her with passion, and Shauna kissed him right back. Whatever was amiss in her life, whatever had gone wrong until now, none of it mattered. When she was with Hansel, her problems fell away, and what mattered was their power and how it harmonized. Hansel's magic intertwined with Shauna's, linking to create something beautiful, something new and unique. Something more powerful than anything Shauna had felt before. Hansel moved his lips to her neck and she gasped, closing her eyes so as to better enjoy the pleasure. Her need for him grew as her skin tingled, and her nerve endings became alive at his touch. Shauna had never felt wanted. Not after her father had died and Valerie had banned her to the kitchen. And certainly not when she had left the house, nor in the year when she'd lived alone. She'd always felt like she was in the way, a vagabond, a vagrant. Unwanted and alone. But the way Hansel touched her made her feel seen. For the first time in years, someone saw her again for the person she was beneath the rags. When it was over, Hansel lay next to Shauna, his arm curled around her shoulders, tucking her tightly against his body. "You're incredible," he said, turning his head and planting a kiss in her hair. "Thank you for tonight," Shauna said, glancing up at him. "And for helping me see your father tomorrow." Hansel nodded. "Of course." Shauna suddenly thought of something. "What time is it?" "Why do you ask?" Hansel asked, frowning. "At midnight the spell is broken, and then I won't be safe anymore." "Don't be silly," Hansel said. "I'll keep you safe. But you still have time, it's just before 11. Shauna relaxed a little and closed her eyes. She had a bit of time still. And Hansel would protect her too. Everything was working out. Soon Shauna's whole life was going to change, and she couldn't wait to finally have her happily ever after. Chapter 17. Shauna must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, she was being woken with a start. Shouts in the bedroom pulled her from a deep sleep, and a moment later, strong hands yanked her from the bed. She could still hear the music of the ball in the background. How long had she fallen asleep for? "No!" she cried out, trying to cover herself. Then suddenly, she was wrapped up in some sort of robe to preserve her modesty. "Hansel!" she cried out, looking around. But all she could see were guards. "Let me go. I'm here by invitation of the prince." "I don't think so," one of the guards said, shaking his head. "We don't know how you got into the palace, but we are going to deal with you quietly and calmly. Your days of thieving are over." "No!" Shauna cried out again. "I'm a guest at the ball." "And where are your clothes? Where is your ball gown?" one of the guards asked. "It's right over there," Shauna said, pointing to where Hansel had undressed her. But it wasn't the dress that lay in a pile on the floor. Instead it was her rags, the torn clothes she had worn all this time. She frowned, unsure how this could have happened, until she realized it must be after midnight. It had to be. She looked towards the closest window, it was still night. The Fae had warned her that the spell would be broken, that everything would go back to the way it was, and Shauna would be recognized again at midnight. "The clothes don't make the man." No, Shauna muttered. "If you fetch the prince, he'll tell you that I'm allowed to be here. I am to be presented to the king." "Oh, you'll be presented to the king, all right," one of the guards laughed. "When you receive your sentencing." Shauna shook her head and tried to fight, but the guards had their manacle hands locked on her arms, and she couldn't break free. She tried to dig for her power, to use magic to fight her way asked, but it was as if her power had been switched off. What was happening? And where was Hansel? How had he disappeared? He told her that he would keep her safe, that he would allow her to speak to the king in the morning. And now she was being arrested, as if she was a criminal. The guards dragged Shauna out of the prince's chamber, down several hallways and finally, toward a large door that could only lead to one thing, the dungeon. "Stop!" A woman's voice sounded behind the guards. The guards spun around and yanked Shauna with them. "Who are you?" one of them asked in disdain. Valerie walked closer to them, eyeing Shauna as if she was nothing but trouble. "What will you do with her?" Shauna was surprised that Valerie cared at all. What was she doing down here? How did she become part of all this? Was this just her ploy? The guardian fae, the pumpkin and car, the dress and rule of midnight. "We will put her in a cell, and let her rot there until the king finds time to decide what should happen to her." Valerie thought about it for a moment, tilting her head a little. Shauna looked at her, trying to recognize some form of kindness behind those cold eyes. Was it possible that she had come to save her? "If it's all the same to you, I'll take her," Valerie said suddenly. "And do what with her?" the guard asked. "Not set her free if that's what you're worried about. I have a personal relationship with her, and she owes me a great debt. If I take her off your hands, it will benefit the both of us. You won't have to struggle with her, and I will get what's owed to me." The guard thought about it for a moment before he nodded, and they shoved Shauna toward Valerie. "Thank you," Valerie said with a gracious smile and bowed. Her green velvet dress suited her, and Shauna couldn't help but wonder if Valerie was the hero in disguise, or another problem she would have to contend with. "Come," Valerie said to Shauna. "And put your clothes back on for God's sake." She shoved Shauna's rags into her arms. Where had Valerie found the clothes? But she didn't have time to think about it too much. Valerie turned her back, and Shauna quickly dressed before Valerie grabbed her wrist and dragged her toward the palace. "You have caused me enough trouble for one lifetime," Valerie scolded. "What's gotten into you? How did you get into the palace, without being arrested in the first place?" Shauna realized now that Valerie had no idea about the Fae, and the transformation that brought her to the palace. Shauna didn't answer Valerie, only hurried along with her because she had no other choice. As soon as they stepped into the cool night air, Shauna breathed a sigh of relief. At least, she wasn't going to be put in a dungeon. "Thank you for saving me," Shauna said. Valerie snorted. "Saving you? Is that what you think I've been doing?" Shauna blinked. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to stop trying to sabotage my life. Warning you away didn't do the trick, so I'm going to put you away where you won't be able to do any more harm." Shauna's eyes widened. She wasn't free, any more than she had been when the guards had dragged her to the dungeon. She tried to get away, her magic rising up. Where had it been a moment ago? But Valerie was ready for her, countering Shauna's magic with power of her own. Just as had happened before when Shauna had gone to the attic in her father's house, magic bound her, and she struggled to stay upright, let alone move her limbs. "How can you do this to me?" Shauna cried out, struggling against the magical bonds that held her down. "What have I ever done to you?" "It's not about what you've done," Valerie said honestly. "It's about who you are. Your father was easy enough to get rid of, and I thought it would be simple to get rid of you too. But it turns out it's not as easy as I hoped, and you are becoming a pain. But no matter, I am going to deal with you once and for all." With a swish of her magic, Valerie dragged Shauna down the road toward a car, and threw her into it. Shauna struggled to keep her balance, but finally gave up and found herself seated in the car. The fight had left her. Valerie's words had shocked her. She had gotten rid of Shauna's father? Had she murdered him somehow? Shauna had thought her father had died of an illness, but could it be? "What are you going to do to me?" Shauna asked, fear clutching at her throat. What if Valerie tried to kill her too? "I'm going to lock you away from the rest of the world, until I've taken care of a new place to live. And then, my dear Shauna, that will be the end of the line for you." You're not going to ruin anything else for me. Your father's house belonged to me by law because I arranged it to be so, and when I sell it, I will have no need for you." Shauna frowned. "What use did you have of me before?" Valerie laughed, an unpleasant cackle that rattled around the car. "You don't understand how these things work, do you? That house would have been yours. Everything would have been yours. He didn't leave me and the girls anything in his will. As if we meant nothing to him. That bastard left us with nothing. I should have seduced him more, tricked him into changing his will. But I didn't think I meant so little to him. I did love him, you know." That was the last thing Shauna was willing to believe. She didn't for one moment trust that Valerie loved her father. The woman was incapable of love. The car finally arrived at the house, and Valerie used her magic to take Shauna to the attic. All the boxes had been cleared out, and the chest had been removed. Shauna was thrown into the empty space. "Your days are numbered," Valerie snarled. "And when this is finally over, I will be rid of you. I can't tell you how long I've waited for this day." She turned and left Shauna alone in the attic. Shauna rushed to the hatch that led down into the house, to get down the stairs where she could escape. But it had been locked with magic. Damn it. She ran to the window, pulling at the handle and pushing at the panes, but it was locked with magic too. She raised her arm and tried to break the glass, using her elbow again and again, but it was like hitting concrete. She cried out when sharp pain shot into her arm. Stupid thing. She'd done more damage to her elbow than the window. With no other way to escape, Shauna started crying for help. Help! Help! But no one came for her. Finally, defeated and exhausted, she sank to the wooden floorboards. This was it. The end of the line. For one blissful moment, she'd really thought that everything would be all right. That Hansel would help her. Instead, he'd left her to be found and arrested. The trade didn't even cover it. She was heartbroken. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Then buried her face and let the tears flow. She cried for her parents, first her mother and then her father, and never truly mourned properly for either. She cried for the home that she should never have lost. She cried for all the pain she had experienced, and for the hope that was gone. How was she going to get away? Her father's house was going to be sold, and then Valerie would probably kill her. Just as she had killed Shauna's father. Shauna didn't know how long she lay on the wooden planks before she fell asleep. When she did, she started dreaming. "Shauna, what are you doing up here?" her father asked, popping his head through the hatch that led to the attic. "There are far better places to play." "I like it up here," she answered, giggling. She had been hiding from her father, and he'd finally found her. "Come, let's make breakfast together," her father said. Shauna nodded and crawled toward her father, but it was as if someone had put up an invisible wall, and she knocked into it. "What's going on?" she asked. She pressed her hands against the force stopping her from getting to her father, and it was then that she noticed how small her hands were. She was still just a child. "I don't know," her father said, scratching his chin. "But I know that you can do anything you set your mind to. And what have I been teaching you about your magic?" "It's there to help," Shauna said, remembering her father's lesson. Her father nodded. "That's right. Maybe you should try yours now." "I'm not allowed to," Shauna pouted. "Of course you are, you should use your magic when you need to. The reason why your training master told you not to was because it's not a toy, but it is a weapon and it will save you if you use it right." Shauna dug down deep, closing her eyes tightly. She did what the master had taught her, about how to unlock her magic. She wasn't very good at it yet, but she would practice until she was. She felt the magic swirl inside of her, and she got excited. But the magic was suddenly out of control, dancing around the attic, getting away from her like a wild animal that broke free from a cage. She jumped out of the way when it tried to attack, but scratches still appeared on her skin. "What am I supposed to do?" she shouted to her dad. You can't use the wrong kind of magic, Shauna, her father said gently as if she wasn't in a crisis. You have been given magic that will do good. It is there to protect you, but it's not to do harm. Don't use the kind of magic that will do harm. That is unseelie magic, and not only will it do you harm, it will get out of control and harm others that you don't want to hurt. Shauna tried to focus on what her father was saying. She tried to find the magic that was good, not using the magic that was born from her fear. That's it, Shauna. Focus on the life inside you, the purity that defines you. Focus on who you want to be, not what you want to achieve. You be able to control your magic then, and you'll be able to unlock the right power. Shauna pressed her hands against the invisible wall again, and this time her magic flowed through her hands, warm and peaceful. Suddenly the wall disappeared and she stumbled forward. Her father caught her in his arms and pulled her tightly against him in a hug. That's it, he said. That's my little girl. I knew you had it in you. She smiled and they went downstairs together to make breakfast. Shauna jerked awake from the dream, and a terrible sadness descended on her. She missed her father so much. He had been taken away so quickly, and Shauna never had the chance to say goodbye. Resentment settled inside her. Valerie had taken her father away from her. She had ruined Shauna's life. The resentment and sadness mutated into rage, and Shauna could feel her hands burning. She was furious, and a moment later, her power got away from her. Just like in her dream, it ran around the attic like a wild animal. The hatch opened, and Valerie appeared, stepping into the attic. What do you want? Shauna snapped. I don't want you here. Valerie laughed. What makes you think you can tell me what to do in my own home? This is my home. Shauna screamed, and with her words came a terrible wave of power. She attacked Valerie with all her might, throwing power at her like she had never done before. The anger that bubbled and boiled inside of her threatened to consume her, but Shauna didn't care anymore. She was blinded by her rage. Valerie fought back. She found her magic too, and for a moment there was a clash in power. But Valerie was strong, stronger than she had been before. Valerie practiced unseelie magic. She was using her power for the wrong things. Shauna was going to put an end to this, once and for all. Valerie had killed her father, so she would kill Valerie. It would only be fair, it would be right. Shauna had already lost everything, she didn't have anything else to lose. She threw her power at Valerie, attacking the woman, but instead of doing what Shauna needed her power to do, it leapt out of control. The house all around them started trembling. What are you doing? Valerie asked, fear in her voice. Stop that. Don't tell me what to do. Shauna shouted, but fear was starting to take over now, melting her rage away. She couldn't control what was happening. Her magic was getting the better of her. She heard a loud crack, and the planks they stood on started splitting. The ceiling started tumbling, pieces of debris falling all around them. You're going to destroy the house. Valerie shouted. Her voice could barely be heard above the rambling of the house around them. Shauna knew that Valerie was right, she was going to bring the house down if she didn't do something. But how could she? Her magic was out of control. And it was more powerful than ever before. I don't know how to stop it. Shauna cried out. She couldn't believe that the person she was going to lose to would be herself. Valerie screamed and covered her face, falling to her knees. And as she cowered in fear, Shauna looked at the woman, and instead of anger and bitterness, she felt compassion. You killed my father, Shauna said. Tears welled in her eyes. You took away everything that was important to me. I had to, Valerie sobbed. He loved you more than he would ever love us. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, you were always first. Do you know what that feels like? Shauna couldn't say that she did, but she understood where Valerie came from. She didn't agree with her methods, killing someone out of jealousy wasn't the right thing to do. But Shauna struggled to find the hatred that she had harbored for Valerie. Instead she felt pity. I can't do this, Shauna said. I can't keep hating you. All it's doing is destroying me. It's ripping my own life apart, and you continue happily on with yours. As Shauna spoke, her power died down. The house stopped trembling and falling apart. Valerie lifted her head and looked around. What are you trying to say? Valerie asked carefully. I'm trying to say, I forgive you. Shauna didn't know where those words had come from, but she realized that she meant them. She did forgive Valerie, even though the woman didn't deserve it. Because no matter how much she didn't deserve compassion and forgiveness for what she had done, Shauna couldn't allow hatred to tear her apart. Her own bitterness was going to be the ruin of her, not Valerie and what she had done. I don't understand, Valerie said. Shauna shook her head. I don't expect you to. You haven't felt love before, so you won't know what it means when you receive it. She turned around and walked to the hatch that led from the attic into the house. She climbed down the ladder, and then walked down the stairs, leaving the house through the front door. Finally, Shauna was free. Free of the sorrow, the anger, the hatred that had chased her all her adult life. Finally, she was free of the pain of losing her father. She didn't know where she was headed now, but finally, the power that had gotten out of control was gone. Shauna knew what the problem had been now. She had wanted bad things for Valerie, she had wished her ill will. And because of that, her magic had grown dark and turned against her. But now, Shauna was giving it up. She would love in peace, even if it meant that she had nothing. Because at least, she wouldn't ruin herself. Chapter 18. As soon as Shauna walked to the road, ready to go back to her shelter, a large army appeared. Tanks rumbled along the road, and cars that were marked with the emblem of the king. Shauna stopped and blinked, watching the guards climb out of the car ready for battle. Hansel climbed out of one of the front cars, dressed in battle armor. When his eyes fell on Shauna, he frowned. Despite her anger toward the prince, Shauna had to admit that he looked incredibly handsome. His battle armor was white, and it complemented his white hair perfectly, making his violet eyes stand out even more. He had a gun strapped to his side and the scowl on his face, at least that was what he'd had until he saw her. What are you doing here? He asked. Shauna gasped. What do you mean, what am I doing here? I should ask you the same thing. Valerie took me home with her after your guards arrested me, or didn't they tell you? No. They told me, Hansel said. That's why we're here. You know. To rescue you. Shauna looked around at all the guards standing by, watching them. Then she looked down at her ragged clothes. Well, I rescued myself. I can see that, Hansel said, running a frustrated hand through his hair. I guess you're a lot more resilient than I thought. Yeah, I can do things myself, she said, shrugging. I don't need you to save me. So you don't have to apologize that you left me for the guards to take away. Even though she'd like an apology for that, her pride balked at the idea of it now. Hansel's mouth dropped open. I did no such thing. I gave them explicit orders not to go into my chambers. That they were to leave you alone. I had important business to take care of, but I was going to return immediately after. But when I came back, you were gone. Shauna nodded. I told you the spell was going to break at midnight, and I wouldn't be safe anymore. They knew who I was after that. I see, Hansel said, frowning deeply. I didn't know. You're just a prince, Shauna said a little mockingly, a smile playing over her lips. You can't know everything. Hansel's eyes widened, but when he realized there was humor in her comments, he grinned at her. Well, you're safe now. No thanks to you, Shauna said, feeling the need to stick it to him one last time. Hansel sighed. I know. I couldn't come to save you, which would have been good for my ego. He cocked his head at her. But I can do what I promised, I can take you to see my father, to speak to him. Shauna looked back at the house, and she knew that Valerie was still in there, shaken by what had happened. Shauna nodded. I would like that. She climbed into the car with Hansel, and the army started their procession back to the palace. As they drove, Shauna looked out of the window at the city sliding by. It's strange to think that last night, when I drove in the streets, I was nothing more than a vagabond in a beautiful ball gown, ready to take on the world with ferocity and rage. She looked at the prince. Now everything has changed. How? I still want the same things, but it feels… I'm not sure. It feels like something has changed. Hansel reached for her hand and lifted it to his mouth, brushing his lips against her knuckles. I know what's changed. What? You've found who you are. I can see it in the way you carry yourself now. You have a new certainty, a confidence that is incredibly attractive. Now, you are the person you were always meant to be. How can you know that? Shauna asked, surprised at what he was saying. Hansel shrugged. I have different kinds of power, remember? I am the prince. Sometimes I know certain things. But I want to talk to you about something. What? Shauna asked. About us. I would like to keep seeing you. I would like to be with you. Shauna frowned. Me? A peasant, who lives in a shelter with no money to her name? You, the daughter of a nobleman, he corrected, shaking his head, but not because of that. Not because I found out who your father was, and that you are of noble blood. But because you are an incredible, strong, independent woman, and I find that incredible. I think I might be falling in love with you. Shauna started giggling. She hadn't expected him to say that. Of all the things that had happened to her, this was the most unexpected. When she stopped giggling, Hansel looked confused. What's so funny? It's just that I always thought to be happy, I needed everything I'd lost. But now I realize that I don't, I have everything I need already. Material things don't matter that much, do they? It's about who you spend your time with. And who you choose to be. The prince smiled at her. I agree with you, and that's just another reason why I want to be with you. You're so different to every other person I've ever met. Shauna smiled and leaned forward, pressing her lips against Hansel's. I'd like to give it a shot. I think I could easily fall in love with you too. They arrived at the palace, and the prince showed Shauna into the throne room himself. Her stomach twisted into a knot of nerves when she stood in front of the king. She bowed deeply, her heart fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. Your Highness, she said when she stood once again. Thank you so much for making the time to see me. It means more to me than you will ever know. I hear there has been a lot of chaos in my palace thanks to you. The king's voice was gruff and his face was serious. Shauna swallowed hard. It was a misunderstanding, father, Hansel said. The king groaned. Yes, so you keep telling me. What is it, child? What can I do for you? Shauna took a deep breath, ready to tell the king about the injustice that had been done to her, about her stepmother who had taken everything that belonged to her for herself, ruining the will and wanting to get rid of Shauna once and for all. Since the moment Shauna had decided to see the king, she had rehearsed exactly what she had wanted to say. But now the words stuck in her throat. Well? The king asked when she didn't speak, growing impatient. Forgive me, Your Highness, Shauna said softly. I believe that I shouldn't be here after all. Everyone gasped and the king looked confused. Are you trying to tell me that you've wasted my time? Shauna shook her head. No, that was not my intention. I came here to get justice for wrongdoing. I held a grudge for a very long time, and I wanted to see you, Your Highness, so that I could take away everything from the people who had taken everything away from me. But I just realized that that would be wrong. That would make me no better than them. But it belongs to you. The prince cried out next to Shauna. I know, Hansel, Shauna said, putting her hand on his arm. But I told you in the car, I have everything I need. The rest will come. It means more to me than I am at peace within myself, and that I have control over my power again. That is more important than the fact that I inherited my father's house. Valerie desperately needs that house, and if that is what she needs to survive, then it might be better for her to have it. The king frowned. You are willing to give up your inheritance because someone else needs it more? Shauna thought about it for a moment, and finally nodded. Next to Shauna, Hansel shook his head. I don't understand, this is what you've been fighting for. How can you just give it up? I realized I was just fighting myself every step of the way. The person I became. My father wouldn't have been proud of her. And I don't want to kick Valerie and her daughters out onto the streets to live the life I'd been living until now. It wouldn't be right. I only ask that you decree, Your Highness, that I have a rightful place there too. So that we may coexist, rather than not Valerie having the power to make me her slave again. The king frowned, thinking deeply. Finally, he nodded. By my understanding, you want for them the same kind of safety, peace and warmth that you long for yourself. Shauna nodded. That's all I want. I would like, if it pleases you, to decree that I have a space where I belong, not that anything will happen to them. The king nodded and lifted his hand. So it shall be. When Shauna and Hansel left the throne room, he kept shaking his head. I still don't understand, he said. I thought you wanted what your father left you. Shauna nodded. Until a few moments ago, I thought that too. But I do have what my father left me. I just didn't realize it. I have his power and I have his teaching. She thumbed the locket, still hanging perfectly around her neck. And I want to be the kind of person that he would have been proud of. Kicking Valerie and my stepsisters out onto the street isn't something that he would have been proud of. Doing this is better. Doing this is right. Hansel shook his head and turned to Shauna. The more I get to know you, the more I am in awe of who you are. I still can't believe it, but you are nobler than anyone I have ever met. Shauna smiled and the prince pulled her closer again, kissing her. She allowed herself to melt into the kiss, knowing that finally everything was going to be okay. Epilogue. 6 months later. Shauna stood in her bedroom, closet door wide open, hands on her hips. She was trying to decide what to pack, and what to leave. Someone cleared their throat in the doorway, and when Shauna turned, Valerie stepped in. She looked around the room. After Shauna had returned from the palace, with the king's decree that she was to live in the house as a member of the family, Valerie had been shocked, and then she had been reduced to tears. She had thought Shauna would take it all away from her, and when Shauna had shown her kindness, she hadn't known how to react to it. So, it's going to be strange having this room empty again, Valerie said. Shauna hadn't taken the master bedroom, even though Valerie had insisted. Instead, she had asked for her old room back, and Lantana had moved to one of the guest rooms, giving Shauna what she wanted. Now it was the start of a new chapter in Shauna's life, and she was leaving the room where she had grown up behind a second time. The departure was bittersweet. I'm sure Lantana will be happy to move back in here, Shauna said with a smile. Things had been a little strained at first, but as time had passed they had learned to coexist, even though they didn't really like each other. Valerie shook her head. I don't think so. This room will be here for you if you decide to return. It is only right. Shauna nodded without speaking and started packing her bag. As she continued to walk back and forth from the closet, Valerie stood silently watching. I never thanked you, she finally said, breaking the silence. Shauna stopped packing and looks up at her. What do you mean? When you didn't take our house away from us. I never thanked you. I know it was difficult to do what you did, but I am more than grateful that you didn't turn me out. My financial situation then was. I know, Shauna said softly when Valerie couldn't finish her own sentence. Believe me, I know what it's like to have less than nothing. The year living on the street had taught Shauna a lot about herself. She had done things she wasn't proud of, but she knew what it was like to truly have nothing. And now that she had everything, she would never take it for granted. Well, I just want you to know that we'll make sure everything is the way it should be, and when we do finally leave this house, well, we'll leave it in a state that will make you and your father proud. Shauna nodded. She knew that Valerie would keep to her word. Shauna hadn't turned her over to the authorities for murder, and she could have. Are you excited? Valerie asked. Shauna smiled at her stepmother and nodded. Nervous too. The palace isn't quite the same as the life I grew up in. You'll be just fine, Valerie said. But I'll leave you to it. She left the room, and Shauna finished her packing. When she was finally done, the staff took her luggage to the front door, and a moment later, Hansel arrived. You didn't have to pack any bags, he said, looking at Shauna's luggage. You have everything you need at the palace. Always. I know, Shauna said with a smile. But these are the things I can't bear to part with. Humor me, I'm sure we're going to have enough closet space. The prince laughed and nodded, telling his staff to carry everything to the car. Shauna kissed him, throwing her arms around his neck. I can't wait for us to live together. Hansel grinned. Yes, me neither. It's going to be amazing. But you know we're not technically living together in the true sense of word, right? Technically, you're moving in with my dad. Shauna burst out laughing. She was going to live in the palace with the prince, but the king lived there too, ruling the land. Still, seeing Hansel every day for the rest of her life was something she could get used to. Are you ready to go? Hansel asked. Actually. No, Shauna said. I have one more thing I need to do. I'll meet you at the palace. Are you sure? The prince asked. Shauna nodded. Yeah, I'm sure. Hansel nodded and climbed into the car. Shauna left the house too, walking through the streets. As she strolled along the road, she thought about all the times she had to take back alleys because she didn't want anyone to arrest her. She thought about how she had to steal every day to have food in her belly, and how she never knew what the next day would hold, or how long her freedom would last. In 6 months so much had changed. She was in a serious relationship with the prince, and if things continued the way they were now, and she was going to marry him. She wanted to be with him, and he wanted to be with her, and there wasn't a day where she doubted that. Even though she wasn't a princess. Even though she wasn't anything more than a girl who used to sleep in front of the fireplace before she lived on the streets. But that wasn't how Hansel had seen her, and that was why it worked. Shauna arrived at the store where Blaze worked. When she walked in, she nodded at his master who was working on the books behind the counter. She wasn't unwelcome in the store anymore. She was an upstanding member of society, though inside she hadn't changed. Hi Shauna, Blaze said. Can you take a quick break? Shauna asked. When Blaze looked at his master, the man nodded, and Blaze and Shauna left the store together. They walked around the marketplace, looking at the different wares that were set on display. So today is the big day, isn't it? Blaze asked. You're moving in. I am. So you're practically royalty. Shauna giggled. Not yet. Besides, I'll always be me. Blaze grinned. Oh, the royal family should start worrying then. Shauna laughed and nudged him. I missed you, she said. Blaze had gone on a journey with his master, making clothes all over the boreal court. Shauna hadn't seen him for a couple of months, and when he'd returned, he'd seemed different. More sure of what he wanted to be. I wanted to thank you, Shauna said. When I had nothing and no one, you were there for me, and that means the world to. Why are you saying it like you're saying goodbye? I'm going to see you, aren't I? Blaze asked. Shauna laughed and nodded. Yeah, all the time. You're my best friend. But I wanted to tell you that when things were horrible, you were the light in the dark for me. I'll never forget that. They smiled. Anytime, Shauna. I mean it. I'm really happy for you. Shauna nodded. I'm happy too. Look at how far we've come. And things can only get better. That would be incredible if they did. Blaze said. Shauna hugged her friend before they said their goodbyes, and Blaze headed back to the store where he had work to do. Shauna headed toward the palace, walking through the city. She stopped by the place where her shelter had been, and looked at the tarp that had been set up against the weather. She hadn't visited it in 6 months. After she had gotten her place back in the house, she had only returned to the shelter to retrieve her things. Shauna lifted her hand to her chest, her fingers wrapping around the locket. The photos of her parents were still inside, and Shauna knew that if she was ever stuck again, there was a Fae who would look after her too. But her life was okay now. Shauna had found her worth, and she had found her future. She walked on toward the palace, and when she arrived at the gates, the guards smiled at her. "How are you today, Shauna?" the guard asked. He knew not to call her anything more formal than that. "Better than ever," she said as she walked toward the palace, climbing the steps to the large front door where Hansel was waiting for her. She couldn't believe that after everything she'd been through, she was finally on the right path. And even though her father wasn't around anymore to see her, to guide her, and to teach her what was right and wrong, she knew that he would be proud of the woman she had become. After all, life wasn't about what you could get out of it for yourself. Shauna had learned that giving to others meant a lot more. And she had learned that doing the right thing with her magic created something unique, something special, the kind of magic that could change the world. She had no idea what her future would hold, but she had started off in the streets, and now she was living in a palace. She had started off completely alone, and now her family wasn't only perfect, it was royal. All she had to do was believe in herself, to have faith in the power that she had been given, and not lose track of what was real. For a while Shauna had lost her way, she had become someone she hadn't recognized. Thanks to the locket her mother had left her, the dreams she had of her father, and the special people in her life like Blaze and Hansel, Shauna had found her way again. She had followed it, and now she had arrived home. "Come," the prince said, taking Shauna's hand. "My father wants to have lunch with us." "Oh, that sounds nice," Shauna said with a smile. She got along with the king well now. And no matter what happened, Shauna would not be brought down again. So, after it all, Shauna finally knew what it felt like to belong, and she could finally say that she was well and truly happy. The end.